All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the regular Board of Trustees meeting for October 11th, 2022. Will you please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Mayor Conrad.
Here.
Pro Tem Graves.
Here.
Trustee Hardy.
Yes.
Trustee Sarcelli.
Here.
Trustee Murphy.
Yes.
Trustee Harris.
Here.
And Trustee Butler is not yet present.
All right, thank you very much. Next on our agenda is citizen participation. This is a chance for anyone in the public to address the board. If you could please state your name and address and keep your comments to 3 minutes. And we just have Butch Haas and Sarah Lincoln signed up. Welcome.
My name's Sarah Lincoln. I live at 236 East State Highway 56.
Butch Hawes, and I hang with her.
We're here to talk about the purchase of Newell Farm as a town park and just give you an update. What's happened in the last 2 weeks since we were here last. We emailed the Reservation of Life Estate to the town last week. So that's in the town's hands and they're reviewing it. And then we were contacted by town legal asking for clarification on some water rights. And our attorney provided that clarification. And then phase 1 of the environmental assessment was started last week when a consultant interviewed us. The consultant came to the house and inspected inside all the buildings, including the house, and walked the land. And the intent is to make sure there's no major hazardous waste dumps or, buried petroleum tanks and those sorts of things, which we know of none, but she wanted to look at everything, and she did a good job. And then we filled out a disclosure. So that has begun. And according to her name was Lauren, she said that she would get her report to the town this week so that they could begin their due diligence. And then as you recall from the last meeting, the legal staff had sent us a quit claim for surface rights so that an oil company couldn't mine the park because we're keeping the mineral rights. And after our review, our attorney sent a counter proposal, and so that's in the hands of the town, and we're waiting for a response on that. So what's next is we appreciate a call from Chris today. He'll talk to you about the land survey, which is due October 24th. And anything else you want to address, Chris, I'm just going to cover this. Concerning the Reservation of Life Estate, we kind of got an indication that we might see a red line on that later this week. And then in about 6 weeks, on November 22nd, there are a whole bunch of things due. And so we just want to keep our eye on those, and so I'll just list them again because you've heard them, but it's things like making sure that the title objection deadline is met, and then the water rights examination is done, mineral rights examination, the house inspection. That's something that has to be thought through as far as what needs to be inspected since we're going to stay there and take care of it. And so we discussed that a little bit with Chris as to what would need to happen. And our request there is that we have uncovered the septic system, the tank covers, and went ahead and, for our own purposes, had it looked at and
Also had it pumped and cleaned.
and all that kind of stuff. So what we just request is that the inspector come and look at that before the snow flies so we can get it covered back up before the soil freezes in a pile. Yeah. And then there's the environmental inspection and the ADA and lead-based inspections. All of those are due on November 22nd. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that town staff's going to be busy doing their due diligence on. And so I'm done.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chris, did you want to talk about the survey?
Do you want to do that now?
I can do that now.
Yeah, that'd be
or
great.
Good reports up to you.
Yeah.
So just as Sarah mentioned, the deadline for us to have a survey complete would be October 24th, with our objection deadline being November 22nd. We've reviewed the title commitment that was that we received, as well as an Alta survey that was done just in 2016, so very recently, and feel like there's really no need to have the expense associated with doing an additional Alta survey. Everything that we would identify has generally been identified on that survey, and anything that would have been new easements that would have been granted or any of those kind of details would show up in the title work. So we think the risk is effectively zero to not do that additional survey work, and so we're gonna waive our right to that survey under the contract.
So that deadline
In the
is-
titles, they accept that?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's good.
So then the October 24th deadline is moot, and the November 22nd objection deadline is now moot. So now it'll be the homeowner's inspection and whatever that looks like, and then due diligence on the water and minerals and that kind of stuff.
And we do, I think Sarah mentioned that, the company that came out to do the phase one environmental assessment, we should have that report back this week. I think she mentioned that, but just to confirm.
Since all the asbestos and lead and all that is gone, and has been for a long time, and that there were no tanks or anything, there was not fertilizer stored, there wasn't anything, so she said it was a very clean site, but we'll see what she comes up with.
Thank you very much for the update.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming in. That's the only one signed up. Is there anyone else that wish to speak under public participation? Sir? Poudre Valley?
Sir.
You always come with checks, yeah.
Wow, all right. Jay Mendoza, Poudre Valley, REA 7649, REA Parkway, Fort Collins. I come before you guys tonight. Our board has authorized $2 million in capital credits back to our members. They retired that in approval, so I'm here to present the town a check for $5,058.45.
Wow, all right.
Short
Thank you very
and
much. Great,
Yeah, so I'll hand it off.
Thanks, appreciate
You guys
it.
have a good meeting.
great.
Thank you very much.
I'll just might find its way into my pocket.
Right.
Cindy's here, so that won't happen.
No,
I'm kidding.
You guys- If you guys have any questions for me, I don't wanna just take off, but are we good?
I think we're good. You live in town, don't you?
I do not. I
Oh,
live-
gosh, so yeah, yes.
I live in Brighton.
Oh, geez. Well, appreciate you driving all the way down for that.
Yeah, always good to make a meeting.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Have a good meeting.
REA's
Stay
great.
safe.
Is there anyone else in the audience for general public comment? Okay, we'll move on now to consent agenda. Would trustees like anything removed from consent agenda? Otherwise, is there a motion to approve consent?
I'll move to combine and approve the items of the consent agenda.
Second.
Who is that, second?
Me.
Okay, trustee Murphy has moved on this, trustee Hardy has seconded it. Clerk, may we have a roll call vote?
Mayor Pro Tem Grace.
Yes.
Trustee Hardy.
Yes.
Trustee Ayers.
Yes.
Trustee Murphy.
Yes.
Trustee Sorsali.
Yes.
Trustee Butler.
Yes.
Mayor Perspeck.
Yes. Okay, we'll get into the regular agenda now. Starts out with the initial draft 2023 annual budget, and I'll kick it off to Administrator Kirk.
Thank you, Mayor Karspec. As we've talked about previously, we have a statutory obligation to present to you a draft budget by the middle of October each year. That is very early in our budget process, as we mentioned before, and so we're just starting to look at things like what are our projections, or maybe what should our projections be for building permit issuance that drives revenue, what should we be looking at from a sales tax projection standpoint, what are some big ticket items we already know about. A good example would be Town Park, the construction of Town Park. That was a goal that the board set for us, so making sure that we're plugging in some of those details. Those are in the packet that was provided for the meeting. We are looking at, right now, projecting a 30% decrease in building permit activity, just to be conservative, beyond what we budgeted last year. So every year, we've generally far exceeded the building permit projections that we've had, because we always budget pretty conservatively. As a result of the slowdown, I think, in the economy driven by inflation, higher interest rates, we're starting to see that building activity slow down. We'll still hit our budget number this year. At least I'm fairly confident that's gonna be the case based on where we're at today, but not like we've far exceeded in the past. And so, projecting an additional 30% slowdown makes sense. Part of the slowdown is driven right now by there are very few buildable lots available in town. A lot of the subdivisions are kind of wrapping up the phases they've been working on. New subdivisions are coming online. So some of that is just driven by, we really only have a couple of builders that are really active right now. And that'll change next year, we think, based on all the current infrastructure construction that's going on. We still wanna be conservative, so that's where we're starting at. We'll go through all of this detail and a whole lot more, as you know, in November as we go through our budget meetings with the town board, but this is just our starting place. And then we would also be, as part of this action tonight, setting a public hearing on December 13th for approval of the budget to make all of our statutory timelines by the end of the year. So happy to answer any questions that you have. Again, this is just a really initial look at our budget and legitimately just to kind of get it in front of you to meet statutory requirements. I have all of our budget meetings with department heads over the next week and a half, and then we'll be coming back to you in November with all the detail that you could ever want. And then some, probably. So our recommended action tonight would be that you simply move to schedule a public hearing on December 13th at 6:30 PM or soon thereafter as practical to consider the adoption of the 2023 annual budget.
All right, appreciate that. Yeah, the board if has any questions, Director Leach, we're all good.
We're happy to answer any questions that you have now. We can talk about it as long as you'd like, or if you'd like, we can, you can just accept the draft budget in its current form, which is pretty rough.
Yeah.
And again, we'll be back on November 8th for the first budgetary meeting. If we have need for a second one, we'll have time to do that prior to Thanksgiving. And then a third, if necessary, we can always do in early December before we adopt it on the 13th. We haven't needed those extra budget meetings the last 4 years, but those are always available if we do.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the trustees? I'll open up to public comment. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to this draft budget? All right, close it, bring it back to the board. If there's not any questions, does anyone like to move on that motion there?
I guess one question to Administrator, I understand this is initial stab at draft. If I understood you correctly, you're gonna meet with department heads here soon and then final, or tweak this. How far off do you expect that might be from this draft?
Not much. I think we have a pretty good idea of the big ticket items already that we know we're planning for next year. And, generally during those budget meetings with department heads, we're refining specific line items. A good example might be like the materials that we use for road maintenance, right? Based on current pricing and should we make some adjustments to our budget, those are typically marginal in the grand scheme of things. The really big ticket items like town park construction is probably the best example because it's a $5.5 to $6 million project. Those are the ones that have a really significant change in our budget. The department head meetings will be mostly like, which of our trucks are scheduled for replacement this year and how many of those will there be and how many computers do we need to replace. And sometimes those meetings drive some things like, hey, we've got a new software that we want to implement to help us be more efficient. And here's what it does and here's how much it costs. And we'll go through those discussions as well. But for the most part, the department head meetings, we'll just start to refine some of the specific line items in the budget. And then we'll also go through and be refining some of the bigger ticket items as well in parallel with that. Does that answer your question?
It does.
So if there's anything we wanna get in there, that would be the November meeting, kind of the first.
And you could tell us now and we
Oh, I
can
have
start
no,
planning for it.
I have no
but
idea,
yeah.
I was just thinking if anyone does.
Yeah, on the November 8th meeting, we'll go through fund by fund. We'll walk you through kind of a high level summary of each fund. We'll walk you through the major expense items and why we feel like those are necessary. Those are either driven by you guys or they're driven by a need. Hey, we have a water line that has to be replaced or upsized as an example, or things that we think as a town staff would be good to do. And we'll explain to you why and we'll talk about why we should include that in the budget during that November 8th meeting.
How did you get to the 30% decline in building growth?
I think that as an initial number, I'll be honest, we just picked that as kind of a reasonable starting place. What we've seen from last year to this year is much more than a 30% drop off, and so we're trying to balance, do we really expect that to continue? One of the things that we do as we go through the budget, we'll look at other building projections. We look at economic journals and economic forecasts from CU and the state of Colorado. We'll look at projections from home builders associations. This one's just a starting place for us to say, if we're gonna lose 30%, what's that look like? More than anything, it's an initial WAG because it's early in the process.
Right, okay. I didn't know if you had any scientific process to.
No, we will have a more refined reason when we bring that to you on the 8th, and it may change based on what we think those, like last year, the economic forecast that we read, both from professors at CU, the state, other, national industry associations. The message then was, hey, there's enough inventory shortage and there's enough demand that we should expect building to continue at its current paces for another couple of years. That was before, kind of skyrocketing inflation and major interest rate hikes. And really, again, we've continued to see a lot of building activity. It's just slowed. Not to say that we're not seeing any, it's just, so we'll go through and read all those same kind of publications and projections again. And I'll continue to say this, the only thing I can guarantee about our projections is that they'll be wrong. Our hope is that we use good information and they're not wrong by a lot. But we're making educated guesses about what the future looks like, obviously, so. And we'll share with you all the things that we've reviewed to kind of make that projection when we come on the 8th.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone would like to move on this?
I move to schedule a public hearing on December 13th, 2022, at the hour of 6:30 PM or as soon thereafter as practical to consider the adoption of the 2023 annual budget and associated ordinances for the town of Berthoud and direct staff to publish a notice for the same in accordance with the local government budget law of Colorado.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, trustee Hardy has moved on this. Trustee Ayers has seconded. Clerk, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Trustee Murphy,
Yes.
trustee Hardy,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Grace,
Yes.
trustee Butler,
Yes.
trustee Sorsali,
Yes.
trustee Ayers,
Yes.
Mayor Kirsnick.
Yes. All right, this brings us to our next agenda item, which is the water policy discussion. We have our attorney, Pete Johnson, who's in the room tonight. Yep, sorry, Pete, you're covered by the laptop. Thanks for coming down.
Sure.
And just for the public, I understand this is a general overview and helps out the new trustees, and we'll all learn something from this and some potential direction at the end. Is that correct?
Yep,
Okay, great,
that
thanks.
sounds
We're
right.
going back in time. It says 2021.
Oh, shoot. There's the first typo. Thank you. That's funny. Several of us reviewed this and none of us caught that the date was wrong, so.
Nobody looks at the first page when it
No.
has pretty pictures at the
Just go
top.
right past the intro slide.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Sorry, I could.
Today is October 11th, 2022 for the record. But anyway, thanks for having me again, and it's nice to see those of you I've seen before and nice to meet some of the new trustees as well. So thanks for having me. And as Mayor Karsbeck said, this will be mostly a general overview. I'm gonna start by a general overview of the town's water rights and water portfolio, talk a little bit about the current supply and demand situation with the town and the town's water dedication policy, that part of the town code that deals with water rights dedications and paying cash for the water demand for new development. And then I'll talk a little bit about the projects we have currently going on and provide an update on various water projects. And then I'll have a few conclusions and can take questions either at the end. I'll be covering a lot of ground as I go through, and I'll try to go pretty quick to save everyone some time. So please feel free to, interrupt me while I'm going through if you have a specific question on a topic as I'm going through as well. All right. So first thing I'll do is just to give you kind of a broad overview of the world that I live in, the world of Colorado water law. There are some unique rules and jargon here, so I'll do my best to give you about a year or so of law school here in about 5 minutes or less. So the first bullet point you see here is what's called the appropriation doctrine or the prior appropriation doctrine. which is really a fancy legal term for what you see below there, which is first in time, first in right, or what we also call the priority system. And this is probably, if you understand anything about water rights in Colorado, this is the thing to understand, that water rights get a priority based on the time that that water right was first put to beneficial use. So first taken out of a stream or river system and placed to a beneficial use. Back in the days when most water rights were generated and appropriated, as we say in Colorado, those were irrigation uses that they started out either irrigation or what we call domestic use, for using in your home for indoor uses. And so the other important thing about the priority system to understand is it is a strict priority system. So that means that if you are the first or senior user within a certain stream or river system, you have the ability to shut off all the other water rights that came after you until your water right is satisfied. So there's no word on high from the state that comes down that everybody's got to take a 15% haircut this year because it's a dry year. That's not the way water rights work. These are private property rights that are administered by the state according to this priority system. And so those with the senior priorities have reliable water rights that can generally yield what is needed by that user even in the driest of years. And it's only as you get further down the priority chain to the more junior water rights that you start having trouble with a reliable yield in drier years or year over year drought type conditions. So it's a simple concept and a simple governing principle, but there's just layer upon layer of complexity heaped on top of that in order to sort of make more innovative and practical and efficient use of what's ultimately a very limited and scarce resource in our state. So that's the first major kind of principle to understand in terms of general Colorado water law principles. Below there you see the units of measure. This is just some of the jargon that you'll hear me throwing out as I go through my presentation here. So the first is an acre foot. An acre foot is about 325,000 gallons, as you can see there. The other way to think of it is it's called an acre foot because it's literally the amount of water that is needed to cover an acre of land a foot deep. So that's generally the larger volume unit that we use to discuss water rights and yield of water rights and projects and those types of things. The next one is cubic foot per second, which is a rate of flow of water. And so cubic foot per second is about 450 gallons per minute. And to put that in sort of a practical context, your average garden hose is maybe about 10 or 15 gallons per minute. So you can see that, a CFS is quite a few garden hoses going at once there. And then the last one here is a SFE, which is just an acronym for a single family equivalent. This is simply a unit demand for water that we use to be able to standardize, quantifications of demand. And the reason it's called a single family equivalent is it's roughly equivalent to what a single family home with a sort of standard size lot, standard amount of outdoor irrigation would use in a given year. And so you'll see from town to town along the Front Range, this value can vary a bit. But in Berthoud, under the town code, it is defined as 0.4 acre feet on an annual basis. So 0.4 acre feet per year for your typical single family home. And again, that makes all sorts of standard assumptions, so keep that in mind. So getting into the town's water rights portfolio, the first thing I'll go through is the town's native water rights. And your first understandable question might be, what does native water mean? And so simply, native water means water that comes from the basin where it's being used, right? So in our case here in Berthoud, we would be speaking mostly about the Big Thompson and Little Thompson river basins here. So you can see, just to orient you on the map here, the Little Thompson River is basically the river you see on the south side of the lower part of your screen there, running on the south side of Berthoud. And then the Big Thompson River, you can see Highway 34, which roughly follows, as you go west, goes up into the Big Thompson Canyon. And so you can see the Big Thompson River as it comes out of the Big Thompson Canyon is flowing just to the south of Highway 34 there. Just to orient you, you can see Highway 25 there running north and south as well on kind of the right side of your screen. So in addition to the river basins themselves, or the rivers themselves, some of the important features in the native system that you can see on this map are the Handy Ditch Headgate, which is on the far western part of your screen, almost into the Big Thompson Canyon. It's basically right up where the dam store is as the canyon starts there on Highway 34. That's a very important structure and ditch system with respect to Berthoud's native water rights. And then as you go down to the right on the Big Thompson River, you can see the Ryan Gulch watershed and Ryan Gulch Reservoir, sort of right in the middle of that watershed. That's another structure that you'll hear me talk more about as we go through the presentation here. Just below that, you can see Berthoud Reservoir labeled. Oh, and I should back up and mention that the green areas delineated in green here are the towns, the city limits for Berthoud. And so going down a little bit from Ryan Gulch Reservoir, you can see Berthoud Reservoir there. That's an important water source to the town that's basically adjacent to the Berthoud Water Treatment Plant, which is the black dot hopefully you can see on your screen there. And then just a little bit south of that is Loveland Reservoir or Loveland Lake, which you'll hear me talk a bit about tonight as well. And then immediately to the west of that whole system of Berthoud Reservoir, Loveland Reservoir, and the treatment plant is Welch Reservoir and the Heron Lakes Pond, which are, well, the Welch Reservoir is a large reservoir operated by the Handy Ditch system. It's where they store a large volume of their water from year to year. And so it's also an important source of water for the town based on the town's water rights in the Handy Ditch system, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And there's some other features on this map as well that I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into the non-native or trans-mountain water rights that the town relies on as well. So getting into some of the specific native water rights, this first is Berthoud's senior water right, or water rights is more accurate because it's really two separate water rights. But both of these water rights together are administered as the number one priority on the Big Thompson River, which, getting back to what I just said about the priority system, that means that even in the worst of years, that Berthoud has the right to shut off any and all other water rights that would be preventing Berthoud from getting 3.0 and 4.14 CFS of these number one priorities. So obviously, this is a extremely valuable, very reliable water right, and you can see here the average yield of that water right is almost 2,200 acre feet per year. And to put that into context, during the water year 2021, that was about the total potable water used and supplied by the town during that year. Now, keep in mind that average yield also includes, this is just a technical detail, but it also includes a portion of this water right that Berthoud has to give to the Handy Ditch Company in consideration for some other benefits that we get from the Handy Ditch Company and a carriage agreement we have with them. So that's not all, that's the average yield of the total water right, not necessarily the amount that's available to the town from this water right. So this water right was historically delivered through the Handy Ditch system. So back in the day, Berthoud had a diversion directly off the Handy Ditch system that went into the water treatment plant. Ever since 1984, the town decreed a change in the point of diversion for these water rights, and then it negotiated a carriage agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation and with Northern Water. And so these water rights now are almost exclusively delivered through the CBT system, which I'll talk more about in a minute here. But basically, you can think of it as they basically come through a pipeline from Carter Lake to the water treatment plant, and that's the primary way that we get delivery of this, very reliable and very important water right. So because we do carry this water through a different system, other than the original point of diversion for it, there are some restrictions and can be some limitations on the times we can carry that water right through the system, and also the capacity, the amount of actual pipeline space we can use in that system at a given time. So for example, this year, Ken called me when I was on vacation and said the Bureau's telling us we gotta turn down the decree water, and it was a bit of a scramble to figure out how to keep that water flowing because of some conditions in their system that caused them to have to reduce our capacity in that system. Luckily, it was only for about a week or so that they had to do that this year, but we are subject to some of those kinds of interruptions that can cause a temporary scramble every once in a while. So that is by far the town's most important water right. It's a fundamental part of the overall town's water supply from year to year. And as I said, it's very reliable because it is the number one priority in the system.
Okay, Johnson?
Sorry, quick question on the last one.
Sure.
So Big Thompson writes, hypothetically say we come across another one and it's a relatively new Thompson water right. Because we have some of the older and senior ones, buying a new one, does that get pulled into our senior shares, or is it, we still have the same water claims, it's just this is younger and therefore less sought after or less reliable, or do
Yeah.
they get combined as one?
No, it wouldn't get combined as one. Anything even if you were to purchase a more junior water right and then change it for municipal use, still retains that original priority because that's how it's administered under that fundamental priority system. So if you were to change the priority date, that's almost the hardest thing you could do with any water right, almost impossible other than, certain specific types of water rights. But if you change that priority date, you would be greatly increasing or decreasing the value of that water right, relative to others in the system. And so if there's any fairness in the water system, I guess that's it, that you're kind of stuck with the priorities you have and you have to, live within those priorities.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. So this is a big, very involved slide with a lot of small text, so I apologize for that, and I promise you I won't go through all of it here. But this is kind of a laundry list of the town's other important native water rights, and very generally speaking, this kind of goes in order of importance with respect to the town's overall water supply. There's some exceptions to that general rule for sure, but that's how I've generally structured it. So the first on the list here are the handy ditch shares that the town owns. This is the reason I point out the handy ditch and that system on the map that I showed you. The town has 40.33 of the 900 shares in the handy ditch system. You can see that the average yield per share is about 11 acre feet, giving the town about 444 acre feet per year of average yield. And you'll hear me talk about this a little more as I get into projects and talk about some of the legal side of the projects we're working on. But the town has some shares that have already been changed and are available for municipal use, and some that are not and that we're in the process of changing. So this entire 40.33 share amount is not yet fully available to the town for use in the water treatment plan and use in the potable water distribution system to all the town residents. The next one on the list here is the Ryan Gulch, which it should be Ryan Gulch Reservoir to be more accurate. So this is the reservoir I showed you on that map. The town has 34 out of 100 shares in the Ryan Gulch Reservoir. And as you can see there, it's about 6.85 acre feet per share average yield. So that's 233 acre feet per year of average yield. This water is currently and probably for the foreseeable future will be used primarily for non-potable irrigation within the town. Right now, it's an important source for irrigation out at the TPC golf course. And so that's primarily how it's been used for at least the last 5 years, really. The next one here is the Loveland Lake and Ditch Company. That's the reservoir fairly close to the town's Berthoud Reservoir and the town's water treatment plant. We have, actually this is incorrect, this is typo number 2. We have actually 78.16 shares. We acquired 2 shares earlier this year. And so that's out of 150 shares, which that's an important number to remember because it gives the town a fairly dominant interest in the company and ability to help run the company to maximize the benefit to the town as a shareholder in that company. In addition to, Ken is now the president of the company and has a good faith duty to all the shareholders to run the company appropriately. But the town does have a dominant voting interest in that company right now, which is useful for reasons I'll get into here as we go along. The next two are fairly minor water sources for the town, but just wanted to include them here for the sake of being comprehensive. The Welch contract rights are contractual rights in Welch Reservoir, which is the reservoir owned and operated by the Handy Ditch Company. So these are somewhat valuable water rights, but they can only provide water under certain conditions that I won't bother you with the complexities of. And then also they're only available for use within a certain area of the town, just because of the original limitations on where those water rights could be used. So we have acquired some of these rights in recent years on a somewhat limited basis, but just sort of as the opportunities arise. These again are a fairly valuable source for the non-potable irrigation system. But again, getting back to the sort of concept of the priority system, these aren't, it's not by virtue of the priority, so it's not a perfect analogy, but they're just not reliable in all years. You can't count on delivery of this water, so it's really more of a backup or sort of drought protection kind of supply, but it's not something we count on being available every year to the town. And then last on the list here are Consolidated Home Supply Ditch and Reservoir Company shares. The town has just 2 shares, so a fairly small interest. These are primarily still used for a farm lease that the town has for a farm on the kind of north end of town. So that is the sum total of the native water rights the town has. The one thing I didn't put on here that I probably should have is Berthoud Reservoir itself. Berthoud Reservoir is really most useful to the town in terms of just its capacity to store the #1 priority water. And so I'll get into that as we talk about projects, but it really is a really valuable storage bucket for the town to be able to use to maximize the yield of its existing water rights, and as just a sort of good backup redundant source if the pipeline from Carter Lake were ever to have problems, or if it was needed to shut down for a while, that Berthoud Reservoir is right there adjacent to the water treatment plant. So it's not as valuable in terms of its actual water right, but in terms of a piece of the infrastructure, it is very valuable as well. So next, the reason I have this map up is to talk to you about the Trans Mountain water rights, or the non-native water rights that the town has in its portfolio. And when you're talking about Trans Mountain or non-native water rights in this area of Colorado, you're almost certainly talking about the CBT project in the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. So that's really, this map is really an overview of their entire system. If you're a water geek like me, you could stare at this map for 2-3 hours at a time and keep gleaning new information. So this is also available on Northern's website if you ever really want to take a close look. I'm going to give you the very broad overview just to describe the Colorado Big Thompson project system, and then also the Windy Gap system, which is kind of an overlay on top of the CBT system. So CBT, as you've probably guessed, is short for Colorado Big Thompson. And so this shows the major features of that system. I'll start kind of on the west side of the screen here, and you can see Lake Granby is really the large reservoir. You can see that yellow orangish line that you see snaking across that right side of your screen is the Continental Divide. And so you can see Lake Granby and Grand Lake just inside of on the west slope of the Continental Divide there. Those are the primary storage reservoirs for the CBT system on the west slope. And from there, you can see the dashed red line is the tunnel that flows underneath Rocky Mountain National Park and underneath the Continental Divide, all the way over to this side of the divide. And then the reservoirs, starting with Mary's Lake and Lake Estes, there's a series of reservoirs up in the Estes Park area. And then coming down to the foothills just west of here, you have Flatiron and Pinewood Reservoir, and ultimately Carter Lake, which is the main storage reservoir on the east slope, and probably the most important part of the east slope system with respect to Berthoud. And then you probably know up to the north, we have Horsetooth Reservoir too, which is an important part of the overall system, but not really that important for Berthoud. It's more of a supply for Fort Collins and some of those further north municipalities. So those are sort of the major components of the storage system. And then just to kind of peel back and orient you a little bit better overall here, The light green you see on the map are the boundaries of the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District itself. So that's the entirety of the area that district serves with water. So you can see it's a big swath of the northern Front Range here, and then it extends all the way out east to the South Platte River, along that South Platte River corridor where they supply a lot of water for irrigation purposes out there to farms and ranches out there. And if you look really hard, I don't even think I can see it on my screen, but you can see Berthoud right in the middle of the bulky part of their service area there, right along the northern Front Range here. So in short, the CBT system is a way to gather and divert water that's available from snowpack on the west slope and deliver it through a tunnel over to the east slope to some large reservoirs here. And that water is provided to, all of these communities that you see here, which are shown in the darker green color within the district there. And for those of you that have been around for a while, you know that the CBT project and the water rights that come from that project are some of the most, dependable, good quality water and therefore most expensive water that you can find on the northern Front Range right now. So that's really the general overview of the CBT system. Now, laid on top of that system is what's called the Windy Gap Project, which I like to think of it as kind of a little brother project to the CBT system. It's a project that came later in time and uses a few additional structures, but really sort of piggybacks on the CBT system to provide more water to the East Slope users in the system. And so if you look on the far west side, just downstream on the Colorado River from Lake Granby, you can see a tiny little reservoir there named Windy Gap Reservoir. So that reservoir was constructed in the 1970s, I believe it was, but so later in time from the CBT project, and from that reservoir, Northern can then pump water back up into the bigger reservoirs on the west slope, and then deliver this Windy Gap water over to the east slope through the same Adams Tunnel and the same system. There's a lot of nuances to how this works relative to the CBT system, but the basic concept to keep in mind is that the operations of Windy Gap and the storage of that water cannot displace the CBT water. The CBT water always has sort of first priority for storage capacity in the system, capacity in the pipeline to bring the water across the Continental Divide, all those different aspects of the system. And so for that reason, and just because the Windy Gap came later in time, so again, those are more junior water rights of a less valuable priority, it's a less reliable yielding system compared to the CBT system. And so I won't get into too many of the details of this because Berthoud's not a participant in the Windy Gap firming project, but that is a project that really seeks to alleviate some of that uncertainty and increase the reliability of the Windy Gap system by building basically a mirror image reservoir to Carter Lake, just west of Carter Lake, that's going to allow for storage of the Windy Gap water on the east slope as well. And for very complex operational reasons, that will greatly increase the yield of the Windy Gap units by basically freeing up more capacity in the system so that it's not fighting with CBT for the ability to deliver and utilize the infrastructure in that system. So you'll hear me talk, well, I'll get into both of these in a little more detail right now. So the town, for CBT units, the town owns 1,038 units. Some of you may remember we just acquired 50 more units earlier this year. And so you're now over the 1,000 mark on total units. And the yield of these units under the town code is 0.6 acre feet per unit. That yield is actually variable and it gets adjusted by the Northern Water District Board every year, actually 2 times a year in most years. This year was a particularly dry looking early season, and so we actually got what they call a supplemental quota. So they did a third adjustment and actually provided more water under the system because a lot of native water rights were really hurting for water this year. And so, but backing up the average yield and the yield that is assigned under the code, so the yield that we use for water rights dedication purposes, for planning purposes, is this 0.6 acre feet per unit value that you see here. So that gives the town, under that average value, a total yield of 622.8 acre feet per year based on its 1,038 units. These CBT units can be bought, sold, and transferred without any water court proceedings, which makes them very unique in Colorado. If you know anything about Colorado water law, you know the water court almost has to be involved in every step of the process. Anytime you're moving water around or changing ownership or changing the type of use, it's generally a water court process. But because these water rights were originally appropriated under this big federal project, there's a whole slew of sort of, different types of uses and places of use that are legal for these water rights. And so you can transfer the water rights within the district as so long as you're adhering to all the district's rules and regulations for those types of things. But generally, water court is not required for that. These water rights can be used directly, so put directly, into a water treatment plant for use, or they can be stored. So for example, Berthoud could store their CBT units in Berthoud Reservoir and hold them there until they needed them for use at the water treatment plant. And as I alluded to earlier, and as those of you who are here for the acquisition of the 50 units earlier this year know, because they are very fungible and very reliable and generally high quality water, these units are very expensive. They're some of the most expensive water in Colorado right now because they're not only for all the reasons I just mentioned, but just because of where we are and the water demands we're seeing on the Front Range generally, but certainly in the northern Front Range right now. So then getting into the Windy Gap units, these are obviously units in the Windy Gap project. The town owns 8 Windy Gap units, and you might think, why do we own 1,000 CBT units and only 8 Windy Gap units? But it's because the yield of a Windy Gap unit is 100 acre feet versus 0.6 acre feet for a CBT unit. So the CBT system was roughly designed with the idea that the maximum yield of a unit would be 1 acre foot. And the Windy Gap project was designed so that the yield of a Windy Gap unit is 100 acre feet per unit. So roughly 100 to 1, difference between the two. And I don't know why it was designed that way, but that's just the way they did it. So that was before my time. But so the town owns 8 units, and at approximately 100 acre feet per year, that's a total of 800 acre feet. And that's once the units are firmed, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get further into projects, but firming generally means, again, that you can count on the yield of those units as what we call firm supply. So in a dry year or an average year or a wet year, there's some minimum amount of yield that you can count on. So the yield might be 100 in a wet year, it might be 50 in a dry year. The firm yield of that water right would be 50 acre feet per year, because that's what you can get out of that water right even in a dry year. And so we'll talk as we get into projects about what we are doing right now to firm the town's Windy Gap units, which are currently not firmed. And so like CBT, Windy Gap units can be used and also sold and transferred without water court involvement, again, making them very attractive, very fungible types of water rights. The big difference between Windy Gap units and CBT units is that Windy Gap units can be reused. And so that is a critical difference, and as you'll see, that difference in the ability to reuse these Windy Gap units is a driving factor in some of the projects that we're pursuing right now to increase the yield of the town's Windy Gap units by being able to reuse that water over and over again through a reuse system. And so that's really the last bullet point here, that we're currently moving forward with plans to firm and to reuse the 8 Windy Gap units that the town owns. And as you'll see, as we get a little further as well, we're also looking at other opportunities to potentially acquire more of these units as well. So getting into the town's water resources master plan, so kind of pulling back to the broader planning scale here, the town has a water resources master plan that was originally prepared by Leonard Rice in 2013. It's been updated several times, and most recently in 2020. And I just wanted to go through some of the sort of high level recommendations of that master plan. So then when we get into projects, you can see what we're doing to implement some of those recommendations. So the first and probably the most critical recommendation here is the development of the town's reusable supplies, which is what I was just mentioning about Windy Gap. So you see Windy Gap described here. And then the other reusable supply that the town will have soon, and does have to some degree already, are change shares in the Handy Ditch. And so when you change a water right, like Handy Ditch shares that were originally decreed for irrigation, as part of that change process, you ask for the court to award you the ability to then reuse that water. And the reason you're able to do that is because out of a change case, you're only getting to use and consume the quantity of water that was historically consumed by the irrigation practices. And anything that actually made its way back to the river, you have to quantify and you have to give that water back as part of your operation of the changed water rights. So I won't get into too much detail there, but suffice it to say that we will claim reuse of the Handy shares in our change case, and so that will also become a critical reusable water supply for the town in addition to the Windy Gap units. And so the way that we develop these reusable supplies is through a system that employs the next three bullet points you see here: reservoir storage, new alluvial wells, and an augmentation plan that goes along with those wells, and then new junior water rights for those wells themselves. And so, again, this can get really complicated, and I'll try to simplify it the best I can, but basically you have reusable water that is coming out of your wastewater treatment plant and being discharged back to the river. And so what you can do is develop wells that are withdrawing water from that same river system, in the town's case, the Little Thompson River, and with those wells, you would claim reusable water rights as well. And so when you're pumping those wells and providing water into the system, that water, a large portion of that water is also coming back through the wastewater system and being discharged back into the river system as well. So you only have to replace, because these are junior water rights, you have to replace what's owed to other water rights in the system, but you only have to replace what's actually being consumed. So it's usually in the order of 10 to 30% of the total water you're pumping out of that system has to be replaced. And so that's where your senior or reusable supplies come in. You use those, either you store them in a reservoir when you don't need them, or if you do need them to replace water to the river directly, then you use those as needed. And so you're keeping a storage and a cache, if you will, of these senior reusable water rights, and then you're leveraging those water rights with these new junior water rights to greatly increase the overall yield of the system. And that's really the way that we're talking about firming and reusing the Windy Gap units, for example, and would also be able to reuse the changed Handy shares when we have those changed in water court. So that's really a driving concept behind a lot of the projects that the town is pursuing right now, is the ability to firm and reuse those reusable supplies. So the next bullet point here is the next recommendation from the master plan is to develop and evaluate the non-potable irrigation systems for the town, and also to acquire additional Loveland Lake and Ditch Company shares for non-potable irrigation use. And so I'll talk more about that as we get into the projects, but we're implementing both of those recommendations right now as well. And then the last major recommendation from the Water Resources Master Plan was to reevaluate the town's water rates. And so that feeds directly into my next slide. Some of you may recall that just last year, the town adjusted its cash in lieu price to $25,000 per SFE, and that was based on that recommendation in the master plan to reevaluate those water rights, and that price was pegged to our analysis of the current unit cost for acquiring new water rights and developing facilities and infrastructure that will make additional water available to the town. So I just wanted to point that out because it feeds from the previous slide, but let me back up and talk about the water dedication ordinance more generally. So the first bullet point you see here is really the kind of driving principle behind the town's water policy and water dedication ordinance, which is quite simply that new development pays its own way when it comes to water. New development needs to either dedicate acceptable water rights, and that's a term of art under the town code, and there's criteria for what make water rights acceptable, including an analysis by our firm whether they're legally usable by the town, an analysis by an engineer about whether they're, sort of physically and operationally usable by the town. So they either dedicate those types of acceptable water rights or they pay the cash in lieu fee to the town. And so that's the $25,000 per SFE fee. And that fee provides funds for the town then to invest in new water rights acquisitions or new facilities, new infrastructure that can either provide new water or facilities like the project I was just talking about that can maximize the yield of the town's existing water rights and thereby providing more water by increasing the yield you're getting from your existing water rights portfolio. The code also, the dedication ordinance also provides incentives for non-potable irrigation systems. And again, there's some nuances and some details, but roughly speaking, a developer gets a 50% credit on the water dedication requirements for potable uses if they are going to use a non-potable irrigation system for their development. And that can vary between, we have developments in town that have non-potable irrigation even of backyards and lots within the development itself in addition to open spaces, and then some that are just for, open spaces within the town, or, there's also non-potable irrigation for the TPC golf course as well. And then the last bullet point here is just water certificates, or the town water bank as we call it. This is really the way that we administer the water dedication ordinance and the dedication of either acceptable water rights or payment of cash in lieu. So we call it the water bank because quite simply, somebody comes in, writes a check, they're then entitled to a certain amount of water credits, and then they get a certificate showing that they're entitled to that number of water credits. Then as they come in and pull building permits to build out their development, the town debits that certificate by the SFEs that they're using for those building permits. And that's how we track their use of their water credits as they're redeeming those through the development process. So that's a broad overview of the water dedication ordinance. And now a broad overview of the current water supply and demand picture. Some of you might remember this part of the presentation from the last time I did this presentation. This is basically hasn't changed since then and hasn't been updated too much, but we've, as we've talked to Chris and Ken and keep an eye on growth within the town, we think all the statements here are still accurate with respect to, where the town currently is with respect to water supply and demand. So the broad strokes are that the town still has sufficient water supply for its currently permitted developments. In other words, platted subdivisions within the town. In the future, the town can add about 2,500 additional taps with its current water rights portfolio, but the additional infrastructure, and a lot of that is the reuse systems that I was just describing, new wells and new storage for reusable supplies. And in addition to that, the development of the non-potable irrigation system will increase the availability of potable water taps. So you'll hear me talk a little bit more about this when I get into projects. But simply put, the more you use raw water, untreated water for non-potable irrigation, that's that much less potable water that you're using for irrigation, and you're not having to treat that water just to use it for irrigation purposes. And so that does two things. It, reduces your operational costs because you're not having to treat as much water for the potable water uses, but it also frees up a certain amount of potable water that would have been used for irrigation, and now that water can be used for, potentially for additional taps within the town. And just to be clear, I throw around the word taps like everybody knows what that means, but tap just simply means a connection of one single unit, such as a single family home, to the water system.
So single family home, so 0.4 acres is what we assume, one tap is 0.4 acre.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Okay.
Again, the 0.4 is sort of a standard unit, so a tap could technically be like, I mean, it could be up to 3 SFEs or beyond if it's a tap, say, for a commercial business that uses a lot of water, or a tap for a gigantic home that has, 12,000 acre feet of irrigated grass or something like that, so.
Or it could be like 0.2 for like a like a duplex or multi.
Yeah, or 0.2 for if they, it would be 0.2 for the demand, for the potable demand, if they have a non-potable system or no outdoor irrigation at all. So yeah, it can vary based on the type of product.
So if we were lucky enough to have like a hotel or something out by the interstate, we'd have to reduce this 2,500 number to compensate for that, or you're saying with commercial built into this, you can still get 2,500?
The taps roughly means SFEs, we're assuming that one tap is one SFE, yeah, that 0.4 acre feet number.
So we do need to calculate in if we had a higher than average water user as a commercial, that would probably affect what we're looking at for the SFE.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and that single family equivalent is a conversion number, right? So, just for the, for the purposes of explanation, right? A restaurant might be, because they're a high water user, a lot of water used in the kitchen, a lot of water used in the restrooms, that might be, rather than 0.4 SFEs, that might be 1.2 SFEs, or the equivalent of 3 single family houses. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we convert everything back to SFEs.
I get that, okay.
Yeah, so
That's
as a hotel, that might be 50 SFEs, right? Because hotels are very high water users typically. And so, yeah, so that would, you just kind of subtract that from the total, right? So if it's 2,500 SFEs roughly is what we're talking about in terms of additional taps, that could be, what would the number be? 50 hotels or 250 houses, right? Does that make sense?
I have a question too.
Sure.
Are these numbers based on the firm measurements or the average yields?
Yes, firm yield.
Firm.
Yeah, we always base it on firm yield to be appropriately conservative in planning for growth and development and making sure you have more than adequate water supplies. Yeah. And so the last bullet here you see is just that the town can meet, pulling back to the big picture, looking at your comp plan build out, which was described in your 2021 comp plan as 10,753 households. The town can meet that water demand with the sources described in the existing 2020 raw water master plan, and also additional South Platte River sources, which again, I'll talk a little bit more about when we get into the projects part. So I believe that is next. So now is when I'll really start going fast through a lot of projects that the town has going on. So please stop me and interrupt me if you have any questions. These are not necessarily in order of importance, but they're I did put what I think are most of the more significant projects kind of earlier in the list here. So the first project I have here is the water treatment plant improvements. This is a multifaceted project and there's a lot going on, and Ken could probably tell you a lot more of the relevant details than I could, but from a sort of big picture water supply perspective, the really important part of this project is the ability to more effectively use Berthoud Reservoir as a water source and just getting much better operational capability with the ability to turn off and on that part of the water supply basically at a moment's notice. I mean, I think they'll be able to do it from like a cell phone at some point in the future. But so that's a huge benefit for those of you that have been here for a while or have been paying attention to the development of the town's water system. You know, this has been a project that's been in the works for a long time. there was a system in place that really didn't function all that well and was pretty unreliable, and it took a lot of manpower to get it working, and once you did, it was hard to start and stop it. And so these improvements that are going on right now are gonna greatly increase the ability to use that reservoir, which, as I mentioned before, really is a really important storage source for the overall town system. So that's gonna be a great improvement, and I think those, I don't wanna get ahead of Ken, but I think those improvements will be done fairly soon.
Couple months.
Yeah, so that's gonna be a huge step forward for the town in terms of the overall water system. The next projects you see here are the Windy Gap units, and really I should probably have just labeled this the whole reuse system, because as I mentioned, it'll also incorporate changed handy ditch shares as part of the reuse system eventually. But this really is that system of developing water storage, new wells, and an augmentation plan that allow us to store and reuse all of the town's reusable water rights in a way that will, again, you're not going out and acquiring new water rights, you're just maximizing the ability to use and reuse the water rights portfolio that you already have. So it's investing the money that you've built up through the cash and lieu program and that, that fund that you built up for these types of investments in water infrastructure that will help generate additional yield from the existing water supply that you have already. And then the next project I have on here is the Carter Lake Pipeline. This is the pipeline obviously coming from Carter Lake. And so right now, Ken and his team and some of our consultants are working on increasing the pipeline capacity up to 7 cubic feet per second, which will be a huge, again, sort of operational capability increase in the town's water system. And then ultimately, the town has rights in the northern water owned part of that system to get up to 10 CFS of deliveries through that part of the system. So between the town's number one priority water rights that can be delivered through that system, the town's Windy Gap units and the town's CBT units can all be delivered through this part of the town's water system. And so it's critical to have enough delivery capacity to be able to deliver enough water to keep up with the water demand in the town. So that's a ongoing project. Now I'm moving on to a couple of the legal side of things. These are the two changes of native water rights to municipal use that we have going on right now. The handy ditch shares that I mentioned earlier, of the town's 40.33 shares, 7.5 of those shares have already been changed to municipal use. And so right now, we're in the process of working with the ditch company on change of the remaining 32.83 shares that we have in the handy ditch. And so we are getting very close, I hope, to submitting the application to the ditch company. It's this nuance of Colorado water law that ditch companies can have rules and regulations that require you to get their approval to change water rights before you go into water court and seek the approval of the state and all the other water users and ultimately the water court to be able to use your water rights for those change purposes. And so right now, we're negotiating with the ditch company on the underlying engineering and what types of operations we'll be asking them to help us with once the town changes these water rights. But our plan is to file this application in water court early next year. I hope we might even be able to get ahead of that, given where negotiations are going right now. I think things are looking pretty good. So the ditch company actually has a meeting on Thursday to talk about our latest proposal, and I'm hopeful that we can start moving forward right after that. So that's the status of the handy ditch shares change. And then the Ryan Gulch shares that the town has, these were actually, they were dedicated along with the handy shares as part of a water rights dedication to the town. But we split these off earlier and filed the change case for these in 2021. And so we're going through that water court process right now. As you can see here, we have a deadline at the end of November. Right now, the case is in front of what they call the water referee.
One second. Click
Sure.
on our screens at That new video blocked the slide. You're front and center on our screen, okay, thanks.
Sure. So right now, the case is in front of what they call the water referee, which is a sort of more informal part of the water court process where you're just trying to negotiate a settlement with all of the opposers. At the end of November, it gets what they call re-referred to the water judge, where you get more on a trial track and it proceeds more like a civil case going to trial in water court. So we're really looking at this end of November deadline as hopefully a deadline for us to iron out some settlements with a bunch of the opposers. And I think we're getting very close. We're working on ironing out a couple issues with the state. And once we get their sign off, I think a lot of the other opposers will probably fall into line and come along with them. So that's the way it works a lot of the time, is the state sort of is the strictest of the opposers that you have to deal with. So we're looking at that end of November deadline and trying to make as much progress on those negotiations as we can until that time. So then moving on to other water rights projects here, a big one that many of you probably know about already is the development known as Wilson Ranch, or now known as the Turion development. This is a significant proposed development out basically in the I-25 corridor area of town. So we're looking at a number of options to deal with the water supply and wastewater demands associated with that development. Simply put, there really isn't enough water in the Big Thompson watershed to supply a development and the demands for a development like that. At least, I mean that by the amount of water that would be available to the town. I mean, obviously, if we got all of the irrigation water in the Big Thompson watershed, there probably would be enough, but that's not going to happen. That water is committed to agriculture for the time being. And so that's why you see here that we identify that really the town is going to need a source of water from the South Platte River to be able to satisfy the demands associated with this development. And so in addition to just where's the water gonna come from, you have to look at the water supply infrastructure and also water treatment needs. Many of you probably know, the water treatment plant for the town is located kind of in the middle on the north end of town here. And so we're probably not gonna pump raw water all the way from the South Platte River to this water treatment plant and then all the way back out to I-25 to supply water for this development. So that likely means we need a different option for water treatment as well. And then similarly, we're almost certainly not gonna use the town's existing wastewater treatment plant to serve the wastewater demands for this property as well. Looks most likely like the wastewater treatment plant out by Love's, which serves it's actually on the east side of the highway, but serves the wastewater coming out of the Love's development there, would be expanded, and that would be the likely source for treating wastewater from the Turion development.
Is that treatment facility, is that the one based out of Johnstown? Is that the one we share with them, or? I guess I'm not clear on that one.
They do have some right to the capacity in that plant. They have to pay for additional capacity if they wanna be able to utilize that. But there is a cooperative agreement in place with Johnstown for that plant. Right now, it's only our wastewater.
It's about as small as you can build a wastewater treatment plant, so.
One size, that's how we do things.
I don't think it doesn't have any solids handling capability right now. So the solid byproduct of the treatment plant process has to be taken back to the main plant. It works, but it's marginally functional, and it'll obviously be significantly more functional as it gets expanded and processes are improved as development occurs out there. It's suitable for what we need it for today.
So right now, with respect to this development, we're engaged in ongoing periodic meetings with the Turion Group and other water supply entities that are looking at a water supply system for this development, and we're continuing to evaluate options. It's still at a fairly high level and still has a ways to go before we have sort of permanent options in place and a permanent plan in place, but we are making progress towards figuring out a viable system to meet the needs of that development. So the next bullet point here is the acquisition of additional water sources. Right now, as you can probably gather from the rest of my presentation, really our emphasis in terms of projects is on maximizing the reusability and getting the additional yield that comes with the reuse system rather than acquiring additional new water rights. But we are keeping our eyes open for opportunities as they arise, and if there are opportunities that make sense for the town or come at the right price, then we will certainly make those recommendations to you all and see if we can go out and acquire water rates that fit that bill. We were able to acquire the 50 additional CBT units this year. As I said, we're keeping our eyes on potential future opportunities to acquire some more Windy Gap units, which could again be further leveraged in that reuse system to generate more yield from those water rights. And we're also looking at opportunities to continue to acquire Loveland Lake shares, primarily for use in the town's non-potable irrigation system. And that gets right into the next bullet point, which is the planning and development for the overall town non-potable irrigation system. Right now, the implementation and development of the town's non-potable system has been a little bit piecemeal. It's been sort of one development at a time and looking at it, without a broader systems perspective. And so Ken and I and Chris are working right now to generate a scope of work for the town's water resources consultants and engineers to develop a master plan for the non-potable system. And that'll dovetail well with the other master planning efforts that Ken's undertaking right now for raw water and wastewater facilities master plans. And so those things will fit really well together for, a comprehensive future plan for the town's water supply, wastewater treatment system, and then non-potable irrigation system. So really taking a comprehensive look at all the different ways we'll use water within the town. And then lastly on the list, I have, I think it's last, alternative transfer mechanisms, which is another fancy legal term for basically contractual deals to rotate irrigation water supplies off of farms on a periodic basis and provide those to municipalities like the town. And so per the board's prior direction, we've been looking at potential ways to use those types of mechanisms to ultimately develop a firm supply for the town. I'll tell you there are some difficulties in the sort of fit of those programs relative to the town's water resources and water rights portfolio. Primarily, it's because the town has these really reliable and senior number one priority water rights as kind of the backbone of your water supply. Then you have the CBT system on top of that you have a substantial interest in. Those two things right now really are the kind of core of the town's overall potable water supply in any given year. Both of those types of water rights are ones that actually yield as good or better in dry years that, compared to more junior water rights that have reliability issues in drier years. And so that makes it kind of an awkward fit with these alternative transfer mechanism programs, because the underlying principle behind these programs is that farmers will, in a dry year, if things are looking bad, farmers are smart and they plan ahead. And so they'll know that, hey, this year isn't looking good, or I'm not gonna plant again because, I'm not gonna have the water to finish out the crops this year. And so they'll see that coming and know that this is a year where maybe I just fallow, half of my operation and provide that water to the town. And so you can plan for that and rotate your water on and off your farm based on the yield of, your water rights. And so it's generally a system that works better when the farmer is incentivized to give the town the water in the drier years. But that's not a great fit with the town system, which actually yields better and more reliable water in those same dry years. So there's some difficulties, but we're trying to figure out more of a systematic approach to figure out if we could get enough of these deals worked together to really, again, sort of create a firm water supply for the town. And again, the ultimate goal of these mechanisms as well is to avoid what they call buy and dry, just buying up agricultural water rights, drying up a farm, and then, you know, the farm turns into a weed patch and a dust bowl, and the town just takes that water completely off the farm, never to be used there again. So that's sort of a taboo in Colorado these days, although still perfectly legal, certainly, but it's a well-known concept and not favorably looked upon by really anyone anymore, so. So getting into the conclusions here, the town is still in an excellent position with its overall water resources. We've continued to acquire water rights and pursue new facilities to increase the yield of your water rights and maximize the use of the current existing water rights portfolio. The town currently has significant funds ready to spend on additional water rights and facilities. But the next few years will be critical to developing more of that reuse infrastructure particularly, but also other infrastructure to provide a reliable water supply for continued growth and development, and also just for the security of the town's existing water supply and demand. And that's really all I have, unless you all have any questions for me.
Thank you. Questions? Hitting that 60-minute before we're starting questions, so might have to cut it a little short here, have to come back. But any questions right off the bat?
I did have a question that was earlier on where you said that there was that hustle when you were on vacation.
Yeah.
What was I gonna do with that question? How can we foresee that better and resolve that better? I mean, is that just a matter of switching from like the CBT water pipeline, then switch over to the reservoir?
Yeah.
What we do is just flip that switch.
That is probably the simplest way to address it in the future, which we'll be able to do with these improvements to the water treatment plant. So that'll be the easiest way to do it, starting, you know, once those improvements are done. It's hard to predict because we're really at the mercy of the Bureau system, and depending how they're managing their storage and deliveries of water rights. I mean, they do a good job of giving us a heads up to the extent we can. They're not, you know, springing in on us too last minute, but there's only so much advance notice they can give us as well. But there are a number of sort of redundancies we're looking at to make sure are in place so that, you know, we don't really get caught without the ability to actually physically provide water. Another option is we have this carriage agreement for the handy ditch system, so we can deliver that water through that system as well. And we're making sure all the facilities are in place to make sure that water would be deliverable to the water treatment plant as
So how
well.
critical was something like that? I mean, I guess as long as we keep our reservoir full, residents probably had never ever noticed something like that, and might cause a little stress with Ken.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
other than that,
Well-
the citizens would probably really not even notice because we have our big reservoir filled up that we just dig a little deeper.
That's right, and keep in mind too that those restrictions are only on the carriage of our native water in that system. We still would have the ability to deliver CBT water or Windy Gap water through that system because, I mean, there could be outages that could affect that too, but those are usually you get notice of those months and months in advance, and they're much more, you know, well planned as part of the overall system operation. But so that, between those two things, either using Berthoud Reservoir or using CBT or Windy Gap supplies, those are the most readily available options to, you know, mitigate any consequences of those kinds of operational outages.
So that 0.4 acre foot, is that calculated at the household or did you guys calculate that? I'm wondering if this is calculating like line loss, any leaks, evaporation at the reservoir.
No, generally does not include that stuff, yeah.
And how does, okay, that's one, how does climate change or just a hotter future play into this? That 0.4 might not be the same in 10 years.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
There is, it depends on how you, so the way that 0.4 is calculated, one of the things that LRE Water did is they looked at total water produced, and then, you know, kind of as simple as it sounds, how much water do we produce? And then how many households or taps did we deliver that water to? And that number works out almost exactly to 0.4 acre feet. And that would include, line loss and other things, unaccounted for water in the system, because we know how much we produced, even if we didn't bill and deliver that much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kinda, yeah.
Yeah,
So
it would
if you
account
start-
for
if you
line
start
loss
with the-
within what we call the distribution system, right?
Right.
From the water treatment plant to the users. So
Okay.
it would account for that, yeah.
So how does this play in if it's 10 degrees hotter, more evaporation?
Yeah, so that's generally, they look at, and those scenarios were analyzed as part of the Water Resources Master Plan, looking at as much as a 50% reduction due to climate change and drought and those types of factors. That's from the other side, right, from the water treatment plant up into the water supply system. And so they did look at, various scenarios based on reductions in yield that could happen under those types of conditions in the overall water supply system. And you just have to basically look at those scenarios and decide what's a reasonable planning scenario to move forward with. And so that's what Leonard Rice recommends in their Water Resources Master Plan. I mean, they basically have one of the sort of middle of the road planning scenarios that we use. So not the most dire, prediction, but also certainly not the most favorable prediction either.
So how are we hitting that? I mean, you look at a new household, you gotta, I guess, I'll use more water in 20 years, but the town had an existing supply. So we could fund our existing residents. We have to look 20 years out for a new resident, they'll be using more than 0.4. So shouldn't we be requiring like 0.5, 0.6?
Actually, so newer residents will probably be using less than 0.4.
If we pass the irrigation ordinance, right?
Even today, that's generally true. Newer homes that are being built on smaller lots, and lot size is a very direct correlation to the amount of water used.
Even though there's more lots per acre than.
Yeah, so per each household, so I think if you're talking about on a per acre development basis, it depends on the way that you look at it. So if you're looking at it on a per household or per single family equivalent basis, newer developments typically using less.
And they're more efficient features.
They're more efficient fixtures,
I get that.
absolutely, so all that kind of, but on a per acre, on a per developed acre basis, it may be slightly more, right, because we're increasing density. Again, the vast majority of water usage is outdoors.
Yeah.
And so less irrigated turf, by virtue of smaller lot sizes or water efficient landscape practices, will reduce the per SFE demand for newer homes even farther than what it is today.
What it is today, yeah. Okay, I'm just getting at a hotter future. And I think we need to prepare for that. My other thing was, if we want commercial, I mean, we have Ludlow, Hammond, just every one of our developments is gonna need some kind of incentive, or it would help for commercial. One of the top ones is lodging. So if we're looking at, we have 2,500 additional SFEs, why don't we just take 1,000 off and figure that's gonna be a buffer for bad things happening in the future and things we wanna incentivize. So I'm worried about when we say 2,500 SFEs, people really think that's 2,500 houses.
Sure.
But we need a buffer, right? So we're really, how are we doing that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and I think when we talk about how much buffer do we have in the system, we obviously don't wanna commit every available water resource we have to new development without having more either developed from the existing water sources that we have. As Pete kind of talked about, we have existing water sources that we can utilize more of if it's stored properly and firmed up and all those things. Or unless we go buy more water with the water rights dedication money that we're collecting each time a new house builds. So I look at it like this. This is kind of maybe the easiest way to describe it. Pete can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm pretty right on this. So we have an existing amount of water, right? And a portion of that is being used by current existing development, whether that was 100 years ago or 100 days ago. We have an existing amount that's being used and we have excess capacity. Each time a house builds and they pay for water dedication cash in lieu, we're basically selling some of that excess capacity. And what's important is that we don't sell all of the excess capacity we have. Now we have no more additional excess capacity but continue to sell taps. So we're making sure that we have a buffer in that sense. At some point, if we got to a place where we felt like, hey, we only have a little bit of excess capacity left, and we've sold and committed all the water that we already own minus just a little bit left, we would come to you and say, we need to stop selling taps. We're not in that condition today, but we talk about what is the right number there, right? Cause I mean, 1 year of homes is about 325 SFEs, or has been kind of on average the last 5 or 6 years. So we need to be looking forward and saying, if it's 2,500 SFEs, this is kind of what we think we have available to us, with the rights that we own and some additional infrastructure constructed. Well, that's plus or minus 8 years worth of growth at 325 SFE. So we either within that timeline, we either have to develop more water, or we have to go out and buy more water, or we have to stop selling taps. And so that's part of why we wanna come to you every year and kind of let you know where we're at. What does our current master plan look like? How has the situation changed? As it goes back to climate change, there were 7 or 8 different scenarios modeled in the raw water master plan, varying degrees of impacts related to climate change. And those included everything from like reduced runoffs in the watershed, reduced ditch flows, increased irrigation demand because it's hotter, all of that stuff. The engineers plug it all into a million spreadsheets that mean nothing to me, but I understand the summary output. To say, in those conditions where we have reduced runoff, reduced ditch flows, increased irrigation demands, all these things, how much can we actually support with what we have today? And so if we keep updating that on a regular basis every few years, we keep acquiring and developing the resources that we have or that we can go and acquire, we should be in perfectly fine shape. If we start to get to a condition where we can't develop the water that we already own, we can't buy more, we're getting less, then we'd have to shut the tap off, to use a bad pun.
Well, it seems like that's almost inevitable if we're not, like, why are we not buying now while it's cheaper and waiting till it's already ridiculous, right? Getting super crazy, and then you're selling $1.5 million houses and half of it's water.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, we are buying water. I mean, as you guys know, we just bought 50 units of CBT from the school district. When there's big chunks available, CBT water is really expensive. There are other sources available to us that are not as expensive. The South Platte water we're working on developing, we think will be significantly less expensive than CBT. And we're confident that's gonna be the case, and pretty confident that we've got a deal that we're gonna be able to get done.
Okay.
There's 100 steps that have to occur to make that happen, but we're pretty far along. We've been meeting for, I don't know, a year and a half now. On this deal, so.
See Madam Wilson in the back always talking about trees, and we're calculating that need in too, right? It's not
Absolutely.
just baby trees with a tree ring, but Yeah.
Total irrigation demand for developed areas in town
great.
is part of our modeling analyses.
Amy Lentz and then a former guy on the tree board, also an arborist, both put out different publications in the last 2 months about you gotta irrigate in the winter. Winter's not the winter it used to be, and just kind of made me think that we might only be looking at this for 3 months, but we wanna look at irrigation for longer and not depend on water efficient landscaping.
Yeah, lengthened irrigation seasons, I think, is even part of that modeling analysis.
Climate change scenarios, yeah.
Those climate change scenarios.
So how are we doing that if we're just doing 0.4? Doesn't that's my whole point here. Why aren't we doing 20.6 and figuring
Well,
that's the
So
problem?
climate change affects supply. It does have an effect on demand in that there may be an increase in irrigation need.
Right.
And so I think all of that is built into the model.
Or
right?
increased
Increased
evaporation.
irrigation demand is included in those modeling scenarios as a result of hotter temperatures, right? But most of the impacts of climate change would relate to our supply, less than what we deliver to customers. That will certainly have an impact, but the bigger impacts, I think, from climate change we see and model, I think, in those models, at least as I understand them, on the supply side. How much water are we actually receiving and then being able to treat and deliver to customers.
Okay, another one is, this isn't, there's probably a couple examples of this. The only one I can think of is the south end of Wagner, where in maps it's generally green. And if we're gonna ever develop that south end, we're gonna need some water. I'm not saying it'll all be turf, but we gotta put some of this aside for recreation too, right?
Yep.
And then also that goes to the reservoirs that they're ultimately for water usage, but they've become for recreation as well.
Mhm.
So this has a buffer in it to keep the reservoirs at a decent level.
Yeah, I mean, reservoirs naturally fluctuate. The
Right.
ones that are used for storage and production of water, they fluctuate, right?
Okay.
We hope we don't have the kind of leveling, lake leveling scenario where it's, bone dry for a chunk of the year and then it's full in the summertime.
And that would just require planning for that.
Yeah, and a lot of that's just how you manage resources, right? So this year, a lot of folks didn't even notice, but Berthoud Reservoir, we drew it down almost as low as we could go before it started sucking air. So the shoreline gets much longer and the body of water gets much smaller. And then as soon as we're able, we start feeding water back into that to fill it back up. And
Okay.
So a lot of that's just water management.
Because I kind of just look at drought restrictions like, in a way, like bad planning. Like we have this opportunity now while it's good, and if we don't take advantage of it in 30 years, well, that's not the climate, that was just bad planning. I mean, that's kind of the point of municipalities as an insurance policy.
I think that's a fair point. It's something we've talked about before. Like if you have to go out to everybody and say, hey, we had one dry year and now we're in a condition where everybody needs to shut off their sprinklers and kill all their landscaping, yeah, that's bad management.
Yeah, and every once in a while
When
it'll
you
happen.
have 6 or 7 dry years in a row, everybody's gonna have water restrictions, no matter how well you plan for. I mean, it's just so some of that is, but I agree with you. I think when you have to start cutting people's water usage, in a non-voluntary way, yeah, you've pushed the line pretty far and probably not managed very well.
And then these are just points, we talked open lands is already setting aside credits for ATMs. So that's built into the Wagner Farm, new conservation easement, apparently it's into this new Osborne Kaywood one. And one of the Carmen farmers, the land agent there, was that you don't have to fallow, one of the options is you can just change a crop, maybe to less crop using less water.
Sure.
And I was thinking of something we need to have firmed. My idea was something like for a Wagner farm or for some recreation that we just tell citizens, hey, 3 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 years, this is gonna be usable. But every 4 years not, it's to save a farm, this is how this works.
Sure.
Versus that it's just dry because we gave it to new houses.
Right, so you're saying the driving, decision behind it is not necessarily just providing water to the town, it's also.
Well, yeah, it could be used for recreational stuff and people will know that it fluctuates and that you won't have green grass every year, it'll go dormant, but at the
Right.
end, we're trying to do this to help the farmers out.
Mhm.
And they'll get maybe some kind of income too.
Mhm.
Cool, I've asked enough questions.
Good questions, really good questions.
I just have go ahead.
I guess I could piggyback on some Will's comments and questions. The first one I had, the Water Resource Master Plan was conducted in 2020. What are the plans for the update for this portion of it? I know you mentioned, facilities as well as non-potent, but.
Yeah, so Ken's busy on the facilities master planning right now, and then we're working on this non-potable master plan, which will sort of piggyback on that or proceed roughly along the same time frame. And then I think probably at that time would be a great time to look at updating the water resources master plan. We'll have some, new inputs to plug into that model and run it and reevaluate it. Just from a timing perspective, it'll make sense given that we'll have those other plans in place and be able to plan around what we know about the future of facilities development and those types of issues.
Okay.
And I think from a specific timeline standpoint, master plans, I think looking at them every 5 to 6 years is a good cadence, right? So probably 2025, 2026, we'll do a comprehensive master plan update, and like Pete just said, we'll have infrastructure master plans done, we'll have non-pod master plan done, that'll change some of the inputs into the next raw water resources master plan.
Okay.
And then once we get into a cycle,
Mhm.
it should, the ideal situation is that continues on in perpetuity, right? That you're constantly updating those master plans every 5 to 6 years.
Absolutely. And I agree with a lot of the conclusions of the 2020 report. But talking, the modeling and the buffering, looking at kind of the modeling that they've done for climate change, you've got, looking at ditch flows, for example. They went with, 15% because they felt like the lowest year, which I believe was 2003, I think,
Yeah, probably O2 or
was at around 29% reductions. And you know, my concern is that, you know, just looking at a simple 15% reduction is not enough buffer, not aggressive enough. Especially looking at kind of where we're at. Just kind of looking into these things, and I keep up on a lot of these things. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Fourth National Climate Assessment. Federal government puts it out every couple of years. Basically, it gives a comprehensive forecast of climate change modeling for the United States and regionally, how it's going to affect water resources, economics. It's kind of a big picture view of everything. But just looking at our area, the Southwest in general, just from the most recent report in 2018, it goes into basically that our hydrological modeling is not following statistically with natural patterns, obviously. And, you know, just looking at the Colorado River Basin, you know, from 2000 to 2014, they've seen 17 to 50% reductions in flow rates on that side. So, from my perspective, I feel like, you know, the next round we go through updating the modeling, I think we should be really looking at worst case scenario to give us that kind of buffer. So, those are just my thoughts.
I agree too.
Yeah, I agree with those concerns too, is make sure that we have adequate resources, especially if things go more drought. But I guess my clarifying question is, if we purchase units or resources, we're paying for them regardless of whether we utilize them in a year or not, correct?
Yeah, and yes.
So that makes me, that helps me understand that the process has to be strategic with the need and the use, because we don't want to spend, well, I guess that's, you know,
You're saying
up
like
to us, do we want to spend millions of dollars on resources we're not using every year?
Oh, I think the assessments, you're saying like an assessment on the share? Like that you have to pay for each assessment of a share you own to the ditch company, is that what you're saying?
Not assessment, like we're acquiring units, additional units and additional water resources in general. We're paying for those resources every year, even if we're not utilizing them.
We only
Right, 'cause we
pay
have so
once
many-
beyond the assessment,
When's assessment?
it's once a year, right? That's just how,
Assessments
once
once a
you-
year.
that's how a ditch company maintains itself.
So you pay the purchase price initially, which is the big check, and then the assessments are just an annual payment you make to basically the company that's operating and providing the water under that system.
But there's some truth in what you're saying in that we pay more assessments for the more shares we own.
Well, that's helping me understand. So are there times when we have resources we paid for that we aren't using because we haven't had the need to use that much or that quantity?
So there's a balance, you also can't just buy up, you know, and Pete can probably talk through this better than I can, maybe I'll just let him rather than try to answer, but you can't just buy up and sit on, you know, mountains of water that you don't have any plan for and that you can't really use.
Yeah, that's true generally in terms of going out and getting new water rights in the system. Another way, we haven't really been in this position a lot with Berthoud specifically, but I do have other clients that have, you know, significant CBT portfolios in excess of their actual demands, and so they lease a lot of that water back to irrigated agriculture just on an annual basis. And really, most of the time, the value of those leases is pegged to the assessment cost, you know, covering the cost of those assessments plus a little bit of the cost of just doing the transaction. So it's a way to continue to monetize and make sure you're not losing money by not using those assets from year to year. So that is possible within the CBT system, to a lesser extent within the Windy Gap system. Really, the issue it gets down to more of the purchase price, which is, do you wanna, you know, spend basically your cash in lieu fund that you've built up for those acquisitions, and it's gonna cost a lot of money because those again are the big checks. That's why, as I described, you know, right now our focus is really on the facilities component of developing the portfolio and utilizing existing water rights. Now, I don't think water rights are gonna get any cheaper, you know, in this area anytime soon, right? Probably not in our lifetimes. But with that said, you know, if you can focus in the near term on spending the money you have to leverage the water rights you already have, and then as Chris was talking about, you're in the process of doing that and issuing new commitments and new taps, you using then that tap fee revenue to fund additional development and acquisition in the future. So it's really just a matter of kind of, you know, working the market and the market forces, and also working with, you know, your existing water rights portfolio to maximize the yield of that portfolio as well.
And trying to firm up what resources we have, so it's available
Right,
as we need it.
exactly.
That's really helpful. That also, I have another question about the cash in lieu. So the cash in lieu is for development, is that correct? That, I'm trying to recall that slide. I just wanna understand the technicalities of the cash in lieu. That was the $25,000 number.
Yeah.
Is that like a per unit number for a developer? And that's supposed to cover infrastructure, water costs, and that just goes into a bucket essentially?
It's not for the developer, this is a complicated system, but so basically $25,000 is for one SFE. Commercial development, there's a SFE calculation done, right, to determine how much, like a restaurant, how many SFEs does a restaurant require? And if it's 5 SFEs, then it's 5 times $25,000, that's how much you pay at building permit phase. So those cash in lieu of water dedication fees are typically paid at building permit. The developer pays cash in lieu for open space. As part of their development to handle irrigation of parks and open space, trail corridors, whatever they're building that's gonna need water in the future. And then the other cash in lieu fees get paid at building permit, as that demand is created by virtue of building a house or a new business or whatever. Does that make sense?
And is that number a standard number, or is that a Berthoud specific?
That's our number, and it's based off a whole host of things. Both on what it cost us to buy the water that we're effectively selling, right? Cause it's like what we're selling sort of is existing capacity. And that it cost us a per SFE number to buy and develop that existing capacity, but we're also trying to account for what's it gonna cost us to buy the next thing, which is dramatically more expensive than what we paid the last time. And so there's a balance there. And that number is what we think it will cost us per SFE to develop the next big chunk of capacity that we'll have to go out and buy
Okay,
or develop.
that's helpful to know. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'd like to open it up to public in case they have any questions for Attorney Johnson. Is anyone in the audience like to speak? Okay, seeing none, bring it back to the board. I have other questions, but I think with the time frame, unless trustees have anything else pressing, are you looking for direction? I think ATMs are what we want to talk about, and then also you brought up water dedication at the retreat.
Yep.
And we didn't really cover that.
Water dedication, really as it relates to open space, we've talked through an idea. You may or may not recall, the newer trustees probably weren't part of this conversation, but the last time we had this conversation, which was about a year ago, I think, is that right? A developer came and said, hey, I don't think the way you charge for open space is fair. Because your per SFE cost for a house covers roughly a 12,000 square foot lot, right? We're not building 12,000 square foot lots, we're building 7,000 square foot lots. So we're leaving all this capacity on the table, we should get some credit for that. Cause we're taking, instead of building bigger lots, we're taking that land and putting it into open space. So you're charging me twice, that was kind of his argument. I don't know that it's exactly as cut and dry as he presents it, but I think there's some reasonableness that we can adopt into our policy where we can give a developer some credit. If you're building smaller lots, we're still charging you for what you would be paying on a bigger lot. And instead of building that bigger lot, you're putting all that into open space. You should get some credit in your open space for the water you're not, in theory, using on the smaller lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's.
So we've come up with some language and we'll bring to you a modification of the policy that outlines that. And I think in a
They're still
fair
irrigating open
way,
space though, right?
absolutely.
Okay, that's
We
in our
require
policy.
irrigation of open space, even if it's intended to be native grass.
Okay. heritage reasons.
Because if you have a problem, the native grass dies and you have to reestablish, you gotta have irrigation there. And it frankly, it never gets established well without irrigation. We're actually making some other changes to the way that those open space areas are built and maintained, all that stuff. As part of our landscape guidelines, you'll see, you should see later this month or early November.
So yeah, I'd like to see that come back. I personally wouldn't wanna vote on that tonight. I got some reservations.
Yeah, no, we would never ask you to vote on that tonight. We haven't even prepared that language, so,
Okay.
yeah.
I thought you were talking about water dedication cash or SF cash in lieu versus dedication for housing.
There's that conversation as well. We could present to you some options for that, based
brought
on
that
some
up
of the
at the retreat.
prior discussions we've had.
Yeah, that'd be good to come back. Anything else, trustees?
Really based on tonight.
I just wanted to touch on that. That is something that's been kind of a concern I've heard from a local developer who does the smaller lots, is that the fees are disproportionate because they have smaller units that have they're supposed to have a lower cost to the purchase, those who purchase them, but because of the fees, they're having to escalate cost of their units because the fee seems disproportionate with a smaller unit.
I will say, for what it's worth, I disagree with that assumption, and I've told the builders and developers that many times, and I'll stand firm on that. The market sets the price of the house, not the fees that we charge. The fees eat into their profit margin. If you can sell a house for $450,000, you're gonna sell that house for $450,000 regardless of whether or not we give you a discount on fees. And if you can only sell that house for $450,000 and our fees push you over that limit, you can't charge more because nobody's gonna pay for it, right? I mean, the market kind of sets the price for a house. Where I do agree with them is that smaller lots and smaller houses have lesser demand, and our fees have actually all been structured that way.
That's what I thought. We've
Yeah,
already done this.
we've already modified all of our fees to account for small lots and small houses. So a smaller lot and a smaller house already pays less fees than a traditional sized house on a traditional sized lot, which pays less fees than a big house on a big lot.
But the tap fee is the same
The tap fee is the
regardless.
same, but that's the cost of the actual meter, right? That one's calculated differently and it's based on, we're gonna talk about this again as we talk about rates. This is another complicated conversation, but tap fees are typically based on the amount of water that you can draw through that tap, right? So if a 5/8 inch meter has a maximum flow rate of 8 gallons per minute, I'm just picking numbers out of the air, but something close to that. Whether or not that house is actually gonna use that much, you have to account for the fact that they can. And so that sets that tap rate, which is a little different than raw water dedication. I know it's like a million different math conversions all into one, but
So we'll see
Yeah.
that again too.
yeah, so we're looking at, as part of our master plan, we're looking at rates and fees for tap fees, monthly water rate costs, all those things as part of the master plan update.
Awesome. Anything else, trustees?
So what direction do you need, is this just education?
If nothing else, this was partly to just give a really broad overview, 'cause, and I know that this is an enormous amount of information.
It is.
You have to hear it 15 times.
Well,
to
we're,
really
it's hard to
understand.
get you, and I know, cause we have a million things on the agenda, but when you say direction, and we're over an hour now, I don't know, I think that's a valid point of,
Yeah.
we might not see Pete for another year, and I
What do
have
we do
some
with
points I
this?
wanna get in there.
We can bring Pete back much sooner than a year from now.
If not on you, I'm not getting on you, we're just so busy that,
Oh, sure, and I mean, one of the reasons for giving you the sort of comprehensive project update is there will be things that will need to come back in front of you for approval to move forward with some of those projects in the near future, so that's likely when you will see me again.
And we will be bringing back in the near future some policy language changes as it relates to open space. And then during that conversation, we're gonna have a conversation about the options available for cash in lieu versus water dedication.
in ATMs.
That's come up a
Right.
few times, and then ATMs and how formal of a program we wanna have and going out and trying to acquire those. We obviously would accept one today if we had that opportunity, but we're not out actually actively trying to buy rights through alternative transfer mechanisms today.
Hey, Mr. Riccardi had a good point, this is years ago, I think, but just bake that into your water dedication, just, you gotta come with half an ATM.
Mhm.
So they're not going out there looking for some, I'm going off the rails here, I'll
There's the good news is there's a lot of those ideas that we can still talk through, and
I hope we
we'll
do,
have an
'cause we're getting-
opportunity in the near future to talk
Yeah.
through those again. It
Building
will
house
not be a
structure.
year from now.
I do have one just very high level question.
Sure.
I've, in the last couple, well, moved to Colorado 10 years ago, I never knew water could go so complicated. In my profession, I've had to dig into it a little bit. But to Trustee Murphy's, point, just to give you a little feedback from town, is I think we need to be a little bit more, however you wanna look at it, aggressive or conservative with our modeling. And then this, the SFE rate, to the mayor's point, I think we need to, in our next review of this, I think we need to up that as well. This is my opinion.
I agree.
But question to you is, water law, it is so complicated, and we're just scratching the surface, we're an hour and a half in. In some of these laws and the way our country and then, local municipalities, it seems archaic. Is there any, I've heard discussion, from different governmental agencies, maybe what you're referring to, that there could be overhauls or some pretty big changes, with the necessity of this, drought in mainly the lower Colorado, river basin. Is there anything that you're aware of, while we have you here, that we should know in planning purposes? Cause I agree that if we ever have to get to drought restrictions, that's bad planning. And to avoid that, what should we know and how we create policies with what could come from, bigger perspective?
Sure, I mean, I think, the point of, being aggressive in planning for future, climate change type scenarios, is a very good one, and that's definitely a good conservative approach. Like you say, you can say aggressive or conservative, but to just make sure you're considering the, most dire consequences of those scenarios. What you're referring to in terms of, a potential like unwinding of the priority system, for
Right,
example, and a
yeah.
different system of administration of
Like
water.
throw us.
I would say Colorado would probably be the last state in the entire western US in which something like that would happen, because we have a system that has been built on that foundation, a system of, like you say, incredibly complex private property rights that are owned and managed by a million different organizations. And the state has a huge system in place to administer that system of rights. And it would be, an earth-shaking event to try to undo that. I mean, it would take decades to plan something like that, much less to, implement it. So I do not see anything like that coming down the pike anytime soon, not in our lifetimes, certainly. You may know that there's what they call the public trust doctrine, which is basically the counterpart to the priority system, which is just all the water is the property of the state government, and the state gets to decide how that gets allocated, and it's based on this idea of, you're holding it in trust for the public. And almost every year, there's an attempt to try to legislate some form of that and put that on the ballot. And it gets very aggressively, reacted to and shut down because of those kind of dire ramifications of trying to put something like that in place.
Do you think though that climate change crisis could force that?
I think more of what you're seeing, and sort of one of the main focuses of my job right now, is really to find innovative ways to work within this sort of archaic system we have. And I mean, I could go on a rant for, an hour about all the different ways that really smart engineers and attorneys have come up with ways to work within this priority system to move water around in the system and make it much more efficient and, and really maximize the use of what is really ultimately a very, scarce resource that they're not making any more of, and that under, climate change scenarios, we may have less total supply of in the future. So I think that's really what's driving kind of the next steps in innovative, thinking and implementation of those types of concepts to be able to work better within this priority system that we have. I think, again, I mean, it would be a foundational, very dramatic event to try to undo that system. And the bottom line, not to be too cynical about it, but just is there's a lot of vested rights and a lot of money and a lot of public interest that's tied up in the administration of the system as it exists today. And so I think the first question is, would it really be a benefit to undo all that and go with some alternative system that hasn't really been proven elsewhere?
Okay, I was just curious, is any risk with that in our lifetime, I guess?
no, I
I
don't
think the
see
good news
that.
is if there was some fundamental radical shift in law and policy, we would be adjusting over decades just like everybody else would. Like it, it wouldn't happen in such a way that would be like, well, we're screwed, we didn't plan for that, right? We'd have kind of decades where we'd have to unwind this system. We'd be doing that at the same time as everybody else. But it certainly will not happen quickly.
Yeah, I think it's telling what you saw just happen with what is happening with the Colorado River system, which is, you have this order from on high from the feds to say all these water users have to cut back, and immediately everybody's sort of retreating into their corner about, what their state is entitled to under water rights that are not, these are not water rights that are granted or approved by the feds, so they don't really have jurisdiction to say, Colorado has to cut back 30%, and that was almost word for word the reaction from the state engineer of Colorado. Was he said, I understand what they're saying on a policy level, but I don't see them telling me that I have to curtail or restrict the amount of water available to what are ultimately private property rights that my state has granted to private individuals and public entities. And so, and I think, he didn't say this out loud, but he probably thought that, and I don't think, my attorneys are telling me that the feds don't have the authority to tell me to do that, because this is a job that I have by virtue of the authority of the state and not by virtue of the authority of the federal government, so.
Makes sense, okay.
So it just shows you how ingrained those sort of, the priority systems and those systems of state rights are in the way water is allocated and distributed in the West.
Gotcha, okay, thank you.
Sure.
Can I
Yeah.
clarify something really quick, just based on the comments? So my understanding of the single family equivalent is based on how much water an average a single family unit uses. So technically, that's not going to increase. It would maybe only decrease during drought times because they're using less per unit, right? So we wouldn't ever increase that
It'd be the other way around.
SFE,
You'd use more in a drought, cause it's hot.
well, but we
I
would
think
be
what you will,
decreasing
I think what you will
usage,
find
right?
is, practically speaking, while the irrigation demand might be up, people will naturally start to conserve.
Oh, cause the cost at the water rate, you're paying more water?
It
Or
could be a whole,
restrictions
or it could just
or-
be because people know that when there's a drought, everybody needs to kind of chip in and use water efficiently and wisely.
But see, okay,
I mean,
Some
the
we
people
reality.
get into a
have to
policy thing where I
restrict
think
it.
that's our job to prevent that from happening, that's
Well,
planning.
But again, I don't think,
We do that with traffic, we need to do that with water.
but for what it's worth, using water wisely doesn't mean shutting off your irrigation, letting everything die and turn brown.
Right.
What gets used today in an average single family house, I can assure you, is significantly more than is needed to maintain green landscaping.
That's kind of what
And
I'm
so-
trying to understand is what
So
we're using today
even
won't
with drought
necessarily increase.
restrictions, I mean, having gone through the worst drought in California history and dealing with drought restrictions, we imposed mandatory drought requirements because the state obligated us to. Our water usage dropped by 30% in 30 days, and there was probably 6 brown lawns in town. And so, a lot of that is we can be more drought resilient today just by using water more efficiently than we do, not by removing landscaping, not even by removing sod, although some people are happy to do that because they don't like mowing and maintaining and whatever. But you don't have to water your yard 35-40 minutes every single day of the week, right? And in fact, most of the time it's really unhealthy for your yard, but people do it all the time.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
And so, in a drought, you can say, hey, look, we need you to water 3 days a week instead of 5 or 6 or 7. And your lawn, I will assure you, will still be green and you'll use 20 or 30% less water. And so,
That's what I see.
so I think that's what happens in a drought condition, is that people start to naturally conserve without shutting off the taps, right?
Well,
At least that was my experience, having gone through it before.
Yeah, and I'll say as, someone that's been doing this for a while now, that just in the last, I would say 5 years or even less, I think the cultural perception and conversation around that type of efficient water use and planning for drought and being an efficient water user has really changed a lot. And there really is a much better understanding of the importance of that and an understanding of just using water efficiently in your own home and, you know, using less in times of drought. And so I don't think, I mean, I agree with you that, you know, you wanna
I think it's
plan-
greenwashing sometimes, and I think we just gotta be careful of calling it environmental versus an efficiency thing.
Sure.
It's a building incentive, right?
Sure.
It's never going back to the Colorado River, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to the point of concerns about water in general is like, what we can do is conserve and educate people on what that looks like and approve developments that are actively trying to conserve and use water wisely. So that's something we can do without buying more water, is change the mindset of the public and how we utilize water. So I think the town's already doing a lot of that, which has been
Yeah.
pretty impressive.
So by the end of this month, I think we'll see the landscaping guidelines.
And that's ultimately the balance you're trying to strike is, you know, tailoring the water dedication requirements and those SFE values so that, you know, developers feel it's fair and wanna come build products here. But also, you know, if you're being overly conservative from the town's perspective in overestimating those demands, keep in mind that that is building some resiliency into your water portfolio because you're now able to provide for potentially a greater unit demand with the amount of, you know, water demand that you've accounted for in your dedication requirements and your water supply planning.
Yeah, and I think
Makes
practically,
sense.
you know, like, when we ran the calculation, if I remember right, it was 0.36 acre feet or 0.38 acre feet kind of average household. So 0.4 is actually still mildly, but conservative estimate based on what the actual demand is today.
Awesome, well, the trustees don't mind, we could, thank you for your time very much.
Of course.
There's a lot of tough
Excellent.
questions here.
See you.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
hope to see you soon.
We'll bring Pete back again very soon.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Matthews, too, for sticking around. Trustees, do you mind if you take a 5-minute break? Sure. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break.
Run. 30.
Oh, we're gonna hit that for sure.
Well,
Appreciate the
Move that
timeliness though, you trying.
Thank you very much. Then I had questions, I didn't help out.
It's okay.
I think we just did
We're
budget
good, though.
Pete's presentation.
not that was, if memory serves, this time last
All those
year,
measures.
it was one of those 11 o'clock meetings.
I was
We were
there.
just sitting here like face, I don't
Oh,
care
yeah.
anymore.
But you don't have, yeah, exactly.
I just wanna go home. It's cold.
That's where you put all the controversial stuff, because trustees are too tired.
I did
Yeah,
I
those
did
are
not
the
do
Joe
that,
sideways.
I do not do that.
No.
Yeah.
I try to put the controversial stuff up front, we have plenty of time to discuss it.
We'll just speed through everything.
I'm just saying if I was the town administrator.
Oh.
I'm not saying we
This
haven't
is
had that
what he would
conversation
do.
before, I'm just saying we don't do that.
I think
Alright, you ready to roll?
federal government.
Okay. I'll call the meeting back to order. We're gonna go to our final regular meeting item, Metro District Policy, then we'll go on to elected official reports, and then for all intents and purposes, the meeting, we're gonna move on to executive session and adjourn from that, so this will be our last regular agenda item, which is the Metro District Policy discussion. And I'll turn it over to Administrator Kirk.
Thank you, Mayor Karshbeck. This is another somewhat educational item in the sense that we've been working on this policy for a while. It started before the election in April and continued a little bit after the election in April and it will continue until we're satisfied that it's ready to go. We're not recommending tonight, I'll just give you the little update ahead of time. We're not recommending that you approve this tonight. We wanna get it back in front of you. We wanna talk about what's been done since the last time it was in front of the board. Answer questions that you have, and then we'll bring it back at a future meeting as appropriate. So no pressure to make a decision tonight. But again, the idea tonight is let's review the rough draft of the Metro District policy. Let's identify any needed enhancement to the policy or missing areas of the policy that we can. If we can't, that's fine too. And then after that, we finalize this policy language, circulate it out for public review and set a date for board review and approval. During the last couple of study sessions that we've had, meetings that we've had, staff heard the following comments from the board about their priorities as it relates to metro districts. And so I've kind of generally summarized them here. One, board's concerned about approving metro district formation or service plan amendments without having a clear understanding of what the development is intended to look, sorry, that's a typo, to look like, including future land uses, infrastructure, parks and open spaces, et cetera, right? So there have been times in the past where metro district service plans were approved before anything other than a really basic zoning map was in place, and we understand why that gives the board pause, it gives us pause too. So how do we fix that? Two, the board's concerned with metro districts being formed only to pay for limited or basic public services without providing a higher level of amenity than may be normally required by the code. I would also add, developments that might have regional infrastructure improvements we might consider basic, but would be far above what standard development might have to build. A good example might be Ludlow Farm will have to build some major intersection improvements that they're not fully responsible for, but that they are gonna drive the need for. Those are things that, might be looked at in the context of why would we need a service plan or a metro district. Three, the board's concerned about a possible lack of citizen representation on future boards responsible for managing a district or its debt. That's not future town boards, that's future metro district boards. And citizens not having representation on some of those, so we've come up with a possible solution for that. Board's concerned about transparency in the process for new buyers, especially as it relates to understanding future financial obligations they might be responsible for. What does your mill levy look like? What does it look like in the context of this development versus one that doesn't have a metro district? And making sure that you're fully informed on what you're buying and what you're gonna be financially responsible for, and if you wanna do that, more power to you. But making sure that our process ensures that transparency for future buyers. The board might be concerned with total property tax levies. We've had a lot of conversation about what's right there. The board may be concerned with districts not having sufficient funds for maintenance during early phases of development. I think that one was driven mostly by staff, but I think was generally understood and supported by the board. And then maybe others that aren't on my list. As it relates to the policy that was included in your packet, this is just kind of a summary of how we've approached each one of these concerns. This is a rehash of what we went over in our last study session, and with a couple of added details. But with respect to districts being approved or certain major service plan amendments being approved without a clear understanding of what the development is intended to look like, the way the policy is written, it would require that a neighborhood master plan pursuant to our code has to be approved before you consider a proposed service plan or a service plan amendment. That neighborhood master plan, as you all know, is an early phase of our planning process, but it's intended to lay out backbone infrastructure, parks and open space, amounts and locations, future land use designations that would help you then rezone as necessary if that was needed. It really is it's a refined concept plan with preliminary utility studies, with traffic studies that might identify regional traffic improvements or regional utility improvements. So you get a lot of information about the development and what demands it's gonna create on our system prior to approving a service plan in the way that the policy is written. And I think that generally will eliminate that concern where you look at a service plan and you go, you're asking for $80 million in debt authority to pay for improvements in the subdivision, but we don't even know what the subdivision looks like, right? That's not exactly how it works, but cause typically there is a preliminary layout included in there, but it's not binding. The neighborhood master plan is, and so that would give us all much more comfort about what are you actually agreeing to have the taxpayers pay for in the future.
Could you remind me what the variance is for the neighborhood master plan? How much does the next iteration have to look like the neighborhood master plan? Is it 5 or 10%? I can't remember.
It's 10%, but in general, what we would call, so if a developer wanted to make a substantial deviation from their neighborhood master plan when they came in to go through the platting phases of the development process, we would consider substantial like a major relocation of transportation infrastructure, right? Like if a road moves 5 feet to the west to accommodate some drainage infrastructure, we don't consider that substantial. If you take this road and it used to be a major collector and now you're making it a local road, you're moving the major collector over here to the other side of the development, that's absolutely something the board would have to approve as a neighborhood master plan amendment prior to any platting occurring. And the same would be true with major deviations in land use. So if, you know, I'm just throwing out, you know, conceptual ideas here, but if 50% of the land use was proposed as single family residential and you came in, you wanted to make it only 25% of the development be single family residential, that's a significant deviation from the neighborhood master plan. It would require a neighborhood master plan amendment approved by the town board. If you went from 50 to 45%, we would do that just administratively during the platting process. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
The second concern about metro districts being formed pay only for basic or limited public services. The way that we wrote the policy would require, and there's a lot more definition in the policy that was in your packet about what these things mean. But the proponent of the district would have to outline in narrative form for the board to review as part of that service plan approval process how the district is gonna help provide public benefits in 4 or more of the following 7 focus areas. And 2 of them, this is a change based on the conversation we had at the last meeting, 2 of them would be required to be environmental sustainability and smart growth management. So those are defined in the policy about what does that mean. But the metro district would have to pay for improvements that provide public benefit in the area of environmental sustainability and smart growth management, and then 2 other public benefit items from this list. There's a lot of flexibility in that process, but there's some clear definitions about what that's expected to be, or what might qualify, and then they have to make the case to you during that service plan approval process that the improvements they're building will help move the town forward in 4 of those 7 focus areas.
2 being their choice.
2 are their choice, 2 are required to be environmental sustainability and smart growth management. Yep. So the other 2, those are their required classes, then they can choose 2 electives.
Right, okay.
Concern 3, the board's concerned about a possible lack of citizen representation. So the draft policy states that it's the town intent that owner or resident control of the districts occur as early as feasible. we had a long conversation about the legal ramifications of like, you can't just force people who've been elected to serve on a Metro District board to resign and then replace them with new residents. But that the expectation is as early as reasonably possible that those seats are available for election and go through the statutory processes to fill those board
But is the
seats.
initial board really elected, or is it just like draw
No,
hats?
because there are no residents when the initial board's
Yeah.
formed.
So that's kind of where I was getting at in that point of like, the board from the get-go is usually filled with spouses or office people in the developer's office.
Yep.
But as soon as somebody, what I was trying to get at was like, as soon as a resident in that neighborhood wants to be on the board, since that's a non-elected position, they should be able to take that.
Yeah, they are in the sense that they're elected as property owners, they're just the only property owners when the district is formed. And so it's not that they're just picked out of random, they have to qualify to serve on the board just like any other owner in the district, property owner or resident of the
The
district.
people that work for the developer that
So
basically
they typically own a small portion of that
don't
development.
have the intent to own, because they don't actually have to own something,
That's
you just
true.
have to have a contract.
But as soon as you live in the district, you qualify to run for election. As soon as you live in or own property in the district, you can qualify and run in the next election and unseat one of those people.
Yeah, I
if
almost
you're
think
able
that
to.
someone that actually bought something in that district could unseat somebody who hasn't actually bought something in that district.
That is state statute, that's the election law and Special Districts Act. So I think, Charles Norton talked a lot about that the last time he was here about why. I think we all understand the concern you're expressing, but that there's not really a practical way for us to change state election requirements for
And the
districts,
elections are every 2 years in a metro district.
similar to just like ours, staggered.
So is it, I'm sorry, I don't. So HOA, there's a lot of state laws around HOAs with this kind of conversion of the developer board to the homeowner board at a certain completion or, residency occupancy. Is that what you referred to here similar?
Not exactly, no. I think that's a little bit what Trustee Hardy's describing. But again, this board, a Metro District board is made up of people who qualify
Right.
to serve as board members in that district. And anybody that owns property or lives in that district can run for that board during those election cycles. But there's no requirement for anyone who's been duly elected to resign their seat just because they're not considered a resident in the same way that a person that moved into the district is.
And they'd be subject to having their seat replaced by someone who runs against them in 2 years, if there's a resident or a property owner that's not developer controlled. So every 2 years, as you were pointing out, the significance of that, there's the possibility for turnover if there are residents living in the district or property owners besides the developer.
But to my point, is there any criteria of percentage of,
No, because
Resident
they
versus-
qualify as electors in the district and they can run for office. So
So-
the developer has to qualify, the developer or any of his representatives still have to qualify under the law as eligible for office in that district,
And it's
just
fair
like
game.
anybody else, and it's fair game.
so a developer could get uprooted at the first election and it'd be
Absolutely.
100% residential
It
control,
absolutely can be,
even if the development's only 10% built.
correct.
Oh, you
Scary.
need 5 people in the, because there are boards of 5, right?
Well, and it's usually staggered, it's gonna
Yeah.
be 2 and 3 and 2 and
That's
3.
true, you wouldn't wipe out the whole 5-member board because they're not up for election all at
Yeah.
the same time, yeah.
But it could happen pretty quick though.
It could, yeah,
In
within the
HOAs,
course,
developers always maintain some control, until
and
majority
developers wanna
completion.
maintain control for obvious reasons, right, as the development is being built. And there are mechanisms for them to be involved. I think having lived in a metro district in town, there's a whole lot less interest in running for the metro district board than I think we assume there will be. And so in more than one election cycle, there were no candidates for the board other than the incumbents, and so
Well,
that's not
yeah,
an
and that's another
uncommon
conversation,
situation.
cause the elections are kind of expensive as well, so a lot of times
They are.
they're discouraging a whole formal process.
There is some, that is not untrue when you talk about, I only know from my personal experience living in a metro district, there was discussion at the board meetings about, hey, look, we can have an election, there's one candidate who's interested, and it will cost us $30,000 that everybody in here has to pay for to have that election. So do you really wanna do that? And that
I think
person
that's part of the reason why,
and that person said, well,
I think the
maybe
lack
not.
of interest in metro district elections, I think comes more from education and knowledge about what they are still. I think because there's a lot of people that live in metro districts that still think that we rule over those neighborhoods, which we kind of sort of do, but really they have more say in their neighborhoods if they actually got on their own metro district boards.
I think there are probably people that where that's true. I would say from my own experience, the majority of people who live in that metro district absolutely know who is responsible for their metro district. It's not to say that everybody does.
Cause I've had a few people contact me from a certain metro district. And I'm like, well, your neighbor's actually on that board, why don't you go down and talk to him?
And that's okay. I mean, I think that's the right response, and
And they go, how do you know that? I said,
there's
go to your
a
metro
reasonable
district website,
balance
they'll tell
to,
you who's on the board and their address, where they live in the metro district.
So, Administrator Kirk, do you wanna get through all this before questions, or we wanna go on a case by case?
I'll leave that up to you, Mayor.
Cause I think we got a lot of ground to cover, right?
There's only a handful more slides actually.
Okay, cool. Then we'll get on to questions.
But I will go on and then
I think there's no wrong way, I was just wondering.
yeah, that's a fair question. In addition to our policy encouraging districts to be resident or owner controlled as early as feasible, there's some language in there that the service plan should include governance structures that encourage and accommodate that, and the developer proponent of the district would have to demonstrate to you how that's gonna occur under their governance structure that's conceived of in the service plan. And then in the master intergovernmental agreement, which is something that we that draft that was included in your packet, that's an agreement between the district and the town that says these are the powers that you have based on the service plan that is approved. And that master intergovernmental agreement is written in such a way that it would prohibit master or control districts that are only developer controlled. And that is a problem in metro districts. It can also be a perfectly functional way to operate metro districts, and it has and for decades served good metro districts just fine. It's an opportunity for abuse in some cases. And so what our suggestion is that rather than prohibit something that they're allowed to do by law in our policy, that we make it a matter of contract law in our intergovernmental agreement with the district, where they're agreeing not to have control districts that are only managed by developer representatives. And those control districts typically issue all the debt, they oversee all the maintenance, and the sub-districts that are made up of residents are only there to collect taxes.
So we're basically opening up the control district to anybody that lives in any of the metro districts within that development.
What
To
I
be
think
under
we're
control.
suggesting is that there would have to be an outline in the service plan about how that's gonna be dealt with. And so I think there's flexibility included in that process. The developer or the proponent of the district would have to prove to the town board how they're gonna do that. I think there's a lot of different ways they could, if that makes sense.
I mean, I really feel the control district, since it oversees all the other districts, should apply basically to the overlying blanket that, hey, we all live in this overlying district, so we should be able to be on the control district as well.
I think that's one of the ways that they could do that.
Rather than parsing out a little 10 square foot plot of land that says, this is the control district.
Yep.
And we all own a square foot of it, and we're the only ones that can be on it.
Like I said, I think there's a variety of ways that the proponent of the district could address that concern. But what we're suggesting is that it's both discouraged in the policy and then included as a provision in our intergovernmental agreement that they're not allowed to do that.
Could we legally give them a menu option? Just kind of simplify it so it's not so vague across different neighborhoods?
We could, I will say, anytime you try to create options, the first, in my opinion, one of the first things that will happen is the first developer will come up with an option you didn't conceive of, and you'll just be talking about what you should be doing different anyway. And so I think we could, I think it's okay for us to say, this is the expectation and this is what we're expecting you to sign in that master IGA, and you tell us how you're gonna address that concern. And then we'll say whether or not we agree with you. Cause in general terms, I think a lot of that is subjective from the town's perspective.
So I'm thinking
Is
of
that fair to
resident,
say, or am I describing that improperly?
No, I think that's fair, and I think the main issue just to focus in on why the control districts are where the abuse comes from, it's because they will issue debt
right,
that the paying districts don't have a say in. So that's really the concern. It's not just that they're a control district, it's that they will issue debt that the other districts are bound by IGAs to levy taxes to pay. So it's avoiding that particular issue. It's a discrete issue that we're addressing.
Yeah, because the thing with that is like those IGAs are created with the other metro districts by the control district, which are often the same 5 people, cause they're on all the districts until they get people that are interested in running for those offices. Cause you go look at some of these metro districts that we have around here, and you look at the control district, you look at the metro district 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's all the same people, and they hold one meeting after another, and they're making agreements for these other districts, and then boom, 4 years later, a citizen might run and get on there, and it's only on this one district, and then they still don't have any power because the control district is still overpowering that district.
Well, the debt already issued. That's the
Yeah,
issue.
that's already, yeah, it's
Right.
just
and
crazy.
my perspective is from, I guess, a resident, mindset, cause a lot of this has to do with, you know, to Tim's point, is awareness and understanding. And with it varying so much, I think that in it lies a big part of the challenge. If I were to remove from, you know, one community in one district to another, it works completely different. There's a disconnect there. So to somehow more conform, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think in that condition, yes, you would have to learn a new governance structure if it was substantially different. In almost every case though, they're effectively the same because they're all still formed under the Special Districts Act, right? So I mean, there's still these statutory provisions that control how these districts are formed, how they operate, who's allowed to run for the board. Those are it's unusual that those would be dramatically different across districts. The difference really comes from these very large districts that are made up of a lot of sub-districts versus a much smaller district that has one district that covers just a 300 lot subdivision. There is much more complexity in a much larger district scenario. Turion would be a good example of that, right? I think they had 18 sub-districts planned. And there's a lot of good reason why that makes sense, for what it's worth. There's a lot of reasoning behind that. But that's gonna naturally be a more complex district structure because of the scale of that development than say like a Heritage Ridge that's just a single district. Cause it's a single subdivision that's developed in 2 phases, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Concern about transparency for new buyers. We had a few years ago already kind of adopted a new template for required disclosures that are recorded with the properties and required to be provided by the developer when they sell new homes and those kinds of things. And the form of that disclosure was intended to say, this is what, an average priced home in the district. The template from a few years ago was $450,000. I don't know if that's an average price home anymore, but that template would be updated with the service plan anyway. But at the time, that one said, if you had a $450,000 home in this district, this is what your kind of property tax mill levy would be, and here's how that's all broken down, versus what you'd be paying if you're not in the district. Along with kind of a Q&A document that says, here's what a district is, here's how it functions, here's what you're paying for, all that stuff. So as part of that buying process, that those disclosures would be required for the properties within that district. And that should give, generally speaking, people enough information to say, this is either something I wanna do or something I don't wanna do.
You wrote in that, it's on page 6, you wrote in there, that ensure that all developers of the property located within the district provide written notice to all the purchasers of the property. Some of the issues that I found with these metro districts is that the developer is usually not to be seen, and you go into the sales offices, and the people trying to sell you a home in that development often don't disclose it.
But again, it'd be a required disclosure as part of the buying process. And so it's not something that we're expecting the developer to stand in the sales office and hand out to people who are coming to see homes, but when you're going through that closing process, this would be a required disclosure that you'd have to have reviewed and accepted, right? And if you didn't, then I think you'd have a case against the developer that they didn't provide you a required disclosure under the town's policy and their approved service plan.
So no, formal disclosure until they actually go to sign papers for the purchase of the home, rather than they've got something there in the sales office saying, hey, we're part of a metro district, this is what metro districts mean. They can pick up a little flyer.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, as many of you probably know, the salespeople in the metro district or in the builders, cause this is the other interesting part of this issue, is that the builder isn't the one responsible for the metro district, the developer is. The builder is the one selling the house.
Yeah.
Most often, in my opinion, and I think this is getting better because this is a much more kind of a visible topic in Colorado, so I think realtors especially are much more aware of metro districts today than they were even 8 years ago. It's getting better, I think.
It's improved.
Right? But you know, the folks in the sales office at the name the builder's office, doesn't matter. They're not the proponent of the metro district, they actually have nothing to do with it other than they're selling a house in the district, right? So oftentimes that salesperson doesn't know enough to really give you good information. It's why I think it's important that there's a required disclosure that provides kind of a standard set of information rather than like, here's a flyer in the office, cause
Well, that's what I'm saying, it's like the builder's not the one selling the house, so the
the developer's not the one selling the house.
The developer, yeah, the builder's the one selling the house. So it says the developer has to disclose, why not include the builder as also disclosing that?
They do, this would be, yes.
And that's that time of purchase
At
contract?
the time of purchase at the time of purchase, you'd have to have this disclosure provided prior to closing on the home.
But not anytime sooner than that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be,
That's really all you can police.
yeah,
I just see it as, oh, it might hurt my sale potentially of getting them in love with the house if they walk in and see a flyer saying you're in a metro district.
yeah, and maybe that's true. I will say, you know, I know this is a matter of opinion. So take my opinion for what it's worth, which may not be a lot, but I think the
I'm
buyer
throwing all
has an
sorts of my
obligation,
opinions
I
out,
think the
so go
buyer
for
has
it.
some obligation to understand what they're buying before they buy it. It's not just the builder's responsibility or just the realtor's responsibility to make sure that you know everything about that house. Certainly, they have an obligation to disclose what's legally obligated to be disclosed. In this case, this would be one of those things. But the buyer has to do some due diligence too. And so, you know, I know that doesn't always happen, but I think there's some responsibility on the part of the buyer to know what they're buying before they sign
When we start
the
seeing-
most expensive contract they're likely to sign in their lifetime.
No metro district and home ads, hey, come look at this house, there's no metro district.
Yeah.
You know it's being used as a marketing tool, so if we make the sales office, the builder, disclose it in the sales office, they could potentially,
I think that's a very
Deter a
difficult
buyer.
thing to police, but really.
A question, do we have anywhere on our website that's a landing spot to just generally define what a metro district is so that realtors could direct homeowners to that information?
I think we redirect to a different page, but yes, one of the things we've talked about, we're in the middle of a major website overhaul and redesign. One of those things that we will include as part of that redesign is a more specific, more kind of detailed resource for metro district home buyers.
and add links to all the metro districts in the area so they can easily find them.
Yeah, at the time of the contract.
I feel like that would fairly cover our responsibility with making sure that information is available and that it's factual information that they can use, that real estate agents can use when homeowners are doing the research, so.
And in almost every case, we'll just point to the Metro District's web pages. All the Metro District web pages have their service plans and their budgets and
Do we have all
their-
those links on our site?
We don't today. We will
Could we
as
add
part
that
of our
with that other
website.
page that we just talked about?
We are doing that as part of our website redesign. We'll be doing that as part of our, we're in the midst of the website redesign right now. So let's see. So the policy also requires, from a transparency standpoint, that the service plan would obligate the district to file an annual report to the town that might be in addition to the report that's already required by state statute, so they're already required to do that. The details of the report would be included in the service plan as approved by the board. So anything above and beyond that we would expect, I mean, they have to provide their annual financial reports. Those are all available on their websites, they send those to the town. But if there's but again, it'll obligate them to file that report and then outline what details would be above and beyond what's already required in state statute in the service plan. Let's see, still on the topic of transparency, the policy includes a variety of additional requirements of service plans in addition to those of state law. Specifically, a clear financial plan including total debt limitations and administrative operations cost, a summary, and some of that is already required in law. So this is what's required, but also a little bit more. A summary of the public improvements to be constructed, maps of the improvements, a narrative and description of those improvements, and the district's role in constructing and operating those improvements would be required as part of the service and financial plan. In terms of total tax levies, I know this is a controversial topic, or potentially. It's certainly one that we've talked about a lot. The way that we have the policy written, state statute controls what the maximum mill levies would be. Our argument from our perspective is that any lower mill levy cap would be mostly arbitrary. So if state statute allows a certain amount, then unless we have a really good reason for why we should cap it at a lower amount, we think we should just let state statute control. That's our suggestion to you in the policy.
What's the current state one now?
There is a limitation that, the way the state statute reads is that a district cannot issue debt in excess of 50% of the assessed value of the property within the district. So there's a limit on the amount of debt you can issue, but very few districts can get their project accomplished by issuing only 50% of debt equal to 50% of the assessed value. So the statute allows for them to go over that cap if they limit their mills for debt service to 50. So there is effectively there is a 50 mil cap for debt service.
Most of them are gonna go for that,
And
no matter what.
every district we've seen has proposed that 50 mil debt cap, because that gives them the flexibility to issue more debt.
Can we, okay, I get.
So for all intents and purposes, the debt mill levy cap would be 50. The operations and maintenance mill levies are typically 15 to 20. We had a long conversation previously, about arbitrary caps on operations and maintenance is kind of a challenging one too, because we want these districts to be maintained. We want them to be operated effectively, we want their parks and open space and all the other things that stuff pays for to be maintained in an appropriate manner. And so, again, it'd be leaving the mill levies alone in our policy and allowing the developer to propose mill levies that are consistent with the requirements of state statute.
So that brings up a concern of mine, cause some of these metro districts will hire out HOA companies to come in and manage their metro districts.
Mhm.
And the HOA will then add fees on top of that because they say, oh, we need extra funds to do this and that. Well, isn't that what the mill levies and the operations that we're already doing in the metro district collecting funds for? Why are HOAs then coming in and then tacking on HOA fees on top of metro district fees?
So those fees all have to be outlined ahead of time, or they have to be approved by the residents of the district. So you either know what fees you're paying for ahead of time, or you have to vote to approve them. And a good example is we had a metro district approach us recently and say, hey, we'd like to approach the town about increasing our operations and maintenance mill levy. And I said, well, have you asked your residents if they're willing to pay more in fees? Because you've got a funding shortfall for the next couple of years. And they said, no, that's why we wanna come to you, because we don't wanna ask the residents. And I said, well, too bad, I'm not gonna recommend to the board that they even consider it unless you've already gone through that process and your residents voted no. And I said, and if they do, I'd be hard pressed to see the board increasing your mill levy, but that would be part of the process and the discussion, you'd have the right to ask. But until you ask your residents first, we're not gonna give you the right to tax them more.
Well, that's what I'm again with an HOA, so their way around that is to hire an HOA company and then they call it HOA fees rather than a Metro District fee.
But again, they can't just impose fees without them being either pre-approved before you bought it or you voting on it, right? You, like the HOA can't just show up and just start charging random fees.
So the
to
HOA
neighborhood.
can't raise fees or charge additional fees because they're under the guidelines of the Metro District.
I think as you're describing it, the answer is no.
You're on an HOA, are you?
But not a Metro District.
Because you know, it's like you see these stories about these HOAs going out and opposing a fine, now the state's put a cap on it, I think of $1,000 now, where they're foreclosing on homes within the Metro District because of all these HOA fees.
So I think the problem here is we're talking about metros, you're talking about HOAs,
I
but
think we're
Tim's
talking about
thing
two
is,
different things.
but Tim's
Yeah.
thing is they're passing the buck on to HOAs.
They're like, hey, we can get around this without having to go to the vote of the Metro District citizens. Let's just put an HOA in our Metro District and then we can raise our fees there for operations and maintenance.
I'm not sure I understand what you're describing, but maybe that's just
There's
something.
two different fee structures. So they come to us, we approve them with a 10 or 15% maintenance and operation fee. They have a 50 mil cap on their Metro District.
Are you saying the Metro District is the only
But the Metro District then
owner
hires.
in the HOA?
No, but then the Metro District hires an HOA to be part of their operations. And the HOA is then now charging fees called HOA fees and not Metro District fees.
I'm not sure I know what
So
you're
it's almost like
describing.
they're getting double billed.
I don't think that occurs in the way that you're describing it.
It's a good, if that material could be forwarded on to the board. so we
Yeah,
can see.
we'll dig into that a
It makes
little bit.
Because it seems like a kind of a little hole in the whole process of, well, with HOAs, we don't need voter approval to raise fees. The HOA board will just say, hey, we're gonna raise fees.
But the
They're all
HOA
in the
board is
control
made
district.
up of residents, not random individuals that just show up from out of town. And so,
Well, until they get it filled with
Wouldn't it be illegal to
residents.
impose a fee without notification?
Yeah,
Yeah.
HOA fees are a function of contract.
Yeah.
Right, you enter into a property, you buy property, it's covered with covenants, you are subject to those covenants, the covenants say the HOA can raise fees. So that's the nature of an HOA fee, it's a contract fee.
So how do we
and so unless there's an HOA.
disclose to people that, hey, there's a Metro District in your neighborhood that's hired an HOA company?
But I think what you're describing is not an HOA company is
Management.
not an HOA, it's a management company. There are plenty of Metro Districts that hire management companies to operate the district on
But
their
they
behalf.
operate like an HOA. That's where the,
But it's
given
not
like
an
the Greenwood
HOA.
Village one or whatever, that foreclosed on 48 homes. Cause they put a $500 fee because they left their trash cans out. And so,
But I think people moving
Yeah, I'm
into
not sure
HOA
that's
actually
what-
appreciate that.
HOA issues.
I think that's why you choose.
Yeah, again, I don't think those are Metro District issues, I think those are HOA issues. Metro Districts
it's
do-
within a Metro District. That's what I'm saying.
Wait, so
There was an HOA within the Metro District.
It's not
And
uncommon,
the HOA kinda got out of control.
it's not uncommon for there to be a Metro District and an HOA in the same development. That is possible. I don't think we have any in town unless Heron Lakes has an HOA.
They
They
do.
have an HOA on top of their.
in sections.
But again, those HOAs have to be, you have to agree to the covenants when you buy the house that are recorded against the property. You can't just come in, create an HOA that nobody's agreed to that lives there and start charging people fees. It just doesn't work that way. So,
It just seems like they're charging fees for the same things that the Metro District is already collecting fees for through their operations and maintenance.
There is a so I can clarify this pretty quick. Metro districts can exist and there can be an overlay and also HOA within so Heron Lakes, we have townhomes in Heron Lakes and there's an HOA just for those townhomes for the zero maintenance. It pays for water, cable, all the lawn care and so forth. But there's a difference of service of what the HOA is taking care of versus the Metro. There's not an
But see, that's where I'm bringing up this example of down in Denver where they weren't townhomes, they were homes,
Those were homes,
single-family homes.
and there's
That
actually,
was hired by the Metro District.
right, well,
to
that was, they
property
hired
manage under
a
this
property
schedule of
management
HOA.
company that they often manage HOAs as well.
Yeah, and they call themselves an HOA.
Well, there's either an HOA with in a community or not. They can't create a new HOA. But there's also, so there's new HOA laws that just were put
Where
in
they kept
effect.
the fines and all that, so they can't
Yes, and it's
take
pretty
away someone's
restrictive on
house over his
how you
facility.
notice and what the fine limits can be and what the penalties and late fees can be and when you can foreclose. There's a lot more, pretty strict limits on that, out of that case that Colorado and Dora oversees.
And
But-
again, HOAs, the town doesn't have any part in.
Oh, I know, I'm just seeing
that's
these
not-
situations where metro districts are bringing in these HOAs. And because they're the only ones on the board, the controlling district, they voted to have the HOA in there, and then as they build houses, then they do the disclosure, so now you're not only in a house with the metro district, but you're also agreeing to this HOA agreement. And so now you've got two things on top of your regular house payment that you gotta pay for.
Right, from the resident, it can seem, double taxed or fee.
No, I see metro districts redeemed with the amount of HOAs double tax, but that's all the story. But I'm just trying to look at all
Technically,
the,
it's
the things that I'm seeing popping up
Yeah.
and the
There's a
news and
difference.
stuff.
So one of the other things that Attorney Smith pointed out to me that I think might address some of your concerns is that the fees that are contemplated at the time of formation have to be outlined in the service plan and they have to be approved.
With particularity.
With particularity in the district service plan. And so it's not just, hey, we're gonna have the blanket right to charge impact fees within the metro district, which metro districts can charge impact fees, but they will have to specify in the service plan what those will be and what they're gonna pay for and how much they will be as part of that approval process. So there's some protection there too, I think, to what you're describing. In areas where the districts are concerned about, or where we're concerned about districts not having sufficient funds for maintenance during the early phase of the development, the financial plan that would be required as part of the policy must include foreseeable administrative, operational, and maintenance costs. It's not just the financial plan that's gonna defease the debt that's proposed or conceived of, but how is this gonna operate and how is enough money gonna be generated? And then the service plan would be required to also include a funding and reimbursement agreement between the developer and the district that obligates the developer to fund necessary maintenance and operations of the district until the district is financially self-sustainable. So we have had issues where I think developers stopped maintaining improvements too early in the development and put that burden on the metro district, even though it didn't have enough assessed value yet to cover the cost of that maintenance. And so our goal would be to solve that problem. And again, the master IGA was prepared by Charles Norton. That draft that's included, that's another typo, it's designed to implement the policies outlined and to make them some of those a matter of contract law. A good example of that one is the prohibition on control districts would be included in this IGA rather than in our ordinance or policy to make that a matter of contract law. So that's kind of the broad summary of the policy as it's written. I know it's almost 9:30. We're happy to answer any questions you have. Again, there's no expectation that you would approve this tonight. You may not even have questions. You might wanna think about this some more. My goal would be to bring this back to you at our next meeting and continue the conversation until such time as the board's ready to adopt a policy. And so this will be an iterative process.
Let's just do the 9:30 thing, cause we're gonna hit it no matter what. And Mayor Pro Tem had a good suggestion of set another time on it, so do we wanna set to 10? Do you think that'll get us through that, reports and executive session? Probably not.
10:30 is fine.
10:30, okay.
No.
Is everyone, clerk, is it a roll call vote? I haven't done it in a while. How do we do that? Okay, is there a motion to set the new time frame to 10:30 PM? You can just say so.
I'll make the motion,
Okay.
move to 10:30.
I'll second.
Okay, trustee Murphy has moved on this, trustee Sorsali has seconded Clerk, may I have a roll call vote, please?
Trustee Ayers,
Yes.
trustee Sorsali,
Yes.
trustee Butler,
Yes.
trustee Hardy,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Grace,
Yes.
trustee Murphy,
Yep.
Mayor Carlsbad.
Yep, alright, back at it. Any questions for Administrator Kirk?
Yes,
Go for it.
I've got a few of them. Actually, they're for Kirk and Attorney Smith. Some of the things that we've seen with some of these larger metro district plans is, you know, like you said, they got 10 or 7 or 18 of them. Do we have to approve all the metro districts they wanna put in their development over like a 30 or 40-year plan, or can we pace them out and say, we'll approve these first 3 metro districts, and then when you build those out and you get closer to building out these other ones, we'll approve the next 4? Do we have to do it all or nothing, or?
The legal answer to that, I'm not sure about. The practical answer to that is a development like Turion isn't gonna build in that condition. The scale of that development is such that, and the investment is significant enough that in a really large district, they're not gonna make that investment if they don't have some pretty clear idea of what that's gonna look like over a 30-year term, right? Like if they know their development's gonna be a 30 to 40-year build out, but you're only gonna approve 5 years worth, they're not gonna move forward.
Okay, so I guess that kind of comes down to then holding them accountable. If they say they're gonna build X in those 18 districts or whatever over the course of the next 30 years, and 15 years down or 20 years down the line, they come back to a completely different board here and say, oh yeah, this is what these plans look like, because they don't plan that far ahead. We don't get all those plans as far ahead as we wanna see them before we approve a metro district usually. And now they're not building.
But that's what we're saying, you will get those plans before you approve
Okay.
metro district.
For
That's how the
for
policy's
the
written,
entire thing.
for the entire
We're gonna
development.
hold them accountable for the entire thing over the next 35 years, and there's not gonna
And if
be
they
any
wanna deviate from that,
exceptions or deviations of like, oh, we've decided we don't wanna build the golf course or the YMCA clubhouse, or
if they
you know,
want
we're
a
gonna do
substantial deviation from the master plan, the neighborhood master plan or the service plan, they would have to come to you for approval.
so then what's the consequence if they wanna do that, then is there any consequence?
You have no obligation to approve that change.
Okay. They
Any
have to
questions?
stick with the thing and keep building that, okay. I already got this question answered about the sales office. Let's see here, page 3. Let's see if I can get that one. Let's see, that one's already done.
Some of these focus areas we require anyway. If all you're the developer, all you have to hit is water efficiency, and the town's doing that, then they got environmental resiliency covered. And then if critical public infrastructure, we require some of
Yeah,
this.
and this is not a checklist, it's a guideline that they have to come and justify to you during the service plan approval process.
But if we're already requiring it, it shouldn't even get that far. So they've already hit 2 out of 5 by even getting that far, right? I mean, any development I would say is gonna have to hit these, no matter you're a metro district or not.
Well, that's part of the conversation we've had in the past. And so I'll bring it up again. We already have some of the strictest requirements in northern Colorado. I think most developers will tell you that. And they have told you that at the podium in the past.
Mhm.
And so their argument would be, that's exactly why you should be allowing me to form a metro district without imposing even more on top of that. Is you're already requiring me to do stuff that I wouldn't be required to do anywhere else. You're already requiring me to do above and beyond kind of what's typical in the region.
And now we're
That's
adding more
their
stuff.
argument. It's, you can set whatever requirements you want.
Yeah,
At some point though,
cause some of these were pulled from Fort Collins, right? So
yeah,
the extraordinary benefit would be above and beyond. So if we're requiring Farmstead and they're able to hit it without a metro, and Harvest Ridge, they should be required to hit more of these than what we already require, cause they don't need a metro.
I will say, you may recall the first phase of Farmstead had effectively nothing in it,
Uh-huh.
but single family houses.
Right.
And their argument was, hey, we're doing this out of metro, and so we can't afford to fund all this stuff early in the development like we would if we were metro district. The current owners of the farmstead, who are not the original owners, have already said, we can't build all the stuff that you're gonna be requiring us to do in the future phases without a metro district.
That has to go back past all their people,
No, only the people that would
and they're
be,
coming after that.
um,
Well, I mean, Longmont,
So,
let's, a
it's-
better example would be Longmont doesn't allow these anyways, but they're able to build. So I just think we should be stricter, and sorry, Tim, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Could I just get some clarification on that real quick. The reasoning behind the public amenities menu is it's ambiguous enough, so the board has discretion over acceptance or denial.
Correct.
Okay,
Well,
appreciate
and
that.
part of the reason why I think that was brought up when I was talking with Maureen about this one, because we started this on the last board, was that we were getting developments coming in that have to build just the basic stuff. You have to have water, you have to have sewer, you have to have sidewalks, you have to have streets. Well, the one thing about metro districts is that you can't really bond out as a metro district till you've actually paid for that in full, am I correct? So it's not like they need the money in order to build these things, they have to pay for them all in full. And then once their debt is clear, then they can go to the state, bond out, and then they can start collecting metro districts.
Not always, no.
Cause I thought they had to pay for all this in full and in order to bond out.
Nope.
Okay, cause I got that at some metro district, I think at CML 1 year.
Not as I understand it, no.
In fact, typically it's not done that way.
No.
Typically, they're issuing debt on the basis of the assessed value, so they have money to go build infrastructure. Sometimes the infrastructure goes in first, you're correct, and they issue the bonds to pay themselves back. But
And
more
usually,
typically, the bonds issue so that they have the money as an advance.
So they are getting advanced the money and not getting it after the fact.
Yeah.
in some cases,
Well, they're still
that's
getting it
true,
after the
some
fact, cause it's
cases
gonna take
not.
30 years for them to pay off that mortgage that's charged on the metro district. There was a comment on page 4, item number 4, it says a statement that property owners desiring to have the town board consider excluding their properties from the district must file a petition of exclusion. So does that mean a homeowner could come in and say they don't wanna be taxed as a metro district even though they are in a metro district? How likelihood is that?
No, this is when this district is being formed.
That's a matter of state law.
This is not after the fact. Yeah.
Okay,
That's a matter of state law.
Yeah, this is just reiterating what's already allowed in state law.
cause that almost made it sound like, oh, I'm gonna go buy a house in this metro district and
This policy
Opt
was
out of it.
based on the Fort Collins policy,
Okay.
which was based very much so on state law, just kind of reiterating what the state already requires or allows.
Okay.
What was really unique about Fort Collins's policy was it's very prescriptive public benefits. And again, we had this conversation before, but in my opinion, and again, take my opinion for what it's worth, but when I look at Fort Collins's very prescriptive list of public benefits, it was kind of like everybody got in a room, there was 50 people that all were concerned about metro districts, and they just started throwing out like, well, I want this, and I want this, and I think this should be required, and it was like, okay, well, you get a policy, and you get a policy, and that's kind of what it felt like when I read through that. It's certainly tied to some of the goals that they have. A lot of the requirements they were forcing the developer to agree to, the developer was never gonna be financially responsible for. When you say the development must include solar panels on 80% of the homes, the developer's not doing any of that, and they're never paying for any of that, the builder is. And so,
But it get done.
well, it does, but
So, you bring that to a perfect example,
but the benefit is not going to the people that are actually incurring the expense.
But if they built like a solar farm where they put solar panels out in the field on some open space, then the developer would be, or the metro district would be responsible for that, right? Cause it's not on
Potentially, yeah, I mean, it depends on how that would all be structured, I mean, there's a million ways that could happen too, but
But they wouldn't do that anyways, cause we require EV charging, which would cover greenhouse gas. So my worry is the opposite of Trustee Murphy's, is that if we're not prescriptive enough, they'll choose the easy way out.
but you still have the ability to say that's not sufficient and does not generate enough public benefit to justify your district, that's the whole point.
It's at the end of us, so.
At the end of the day, it's your job to
Just like
say-
Fort Collins is, we get that anyways.
A little bit.
We're gonna have
It
a
just-
developer in front of us that says.
But we're gonna
this is-
let them come in and say, here's how we're gonna do that, and then you can say, that's great, but,
Okay.
or you can say, that's great, thanks, right? I mean, it gives you that flexibility, but it puts the onus on the developer first, rather than on the onus on us to come up with every possible public benefit that could ever be created and let them choose from that list, which I don't think is a very useful exercise of our time.
Yeah, makes sense.
So will we see budgets?
Yes. Yeah, all those service plans have really detailed financial analyses included.
yeah.
To the point where you probably won't wanna read them, but yes, they will be there.
To be honest, I think 600 pages, if I recall, something like that.
Yeah, about.
Yeah, of all 18 other service districts, it was a hoot.
And for what it's worth, one of the things that we do, those financial analyses are done by underwriting firms, right? People that have legal and fiduciary responsibility to make reasonable assumptions. And we can do a third-party financial review to say, yes, we agree with those assumptions. We have done that in the past, where we felt like that was a good thing to do. It's not a requirement of the policy. I will say, when we did, the response back we got was, hey, this is, these are normal financial assumptions and reasonable, but you know what, we really don't like the way they laid out the parks and all this, and it was like, wait a minute, why is this financial firm commenting on the layout of the district? None of that is of interest to us in your report.
Right. Which makes it complicated, and we can, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna comment. As a board today, we can dig into this and come up with our plan, but in 10 years with a different board, I don't understand how they're gonna review new, proposals.
For what it's worth, I keep saying this is my opinion. But I think the board, the goal is to be able to provide you information that you can look at and say this is a good decision or not. But not that you need to be Metro District experts or attorneys or financial planners or underwriters. It's a lot like the water, we could train all 7 of you to be water attorneys, or we can give you enough information that you can say, Pete, you're a good water attorney and we trust your judgment in the following conditions, and here's some high level
Right.
policies and goals we want you to
Which I
implement
agree
as
with,
the.
but if we leave this vague enough, or too vague, again, to Will's point, if we're not requiring, either more standards and we're not limiting debt caps, that just leaves a lot of flexibility. And we're not experts, so how do we look at 600 pages of budgets and those proposals and make heads or tails of it?
I think a lot of that depends on how much trust you have in us and our attorneys that review those plans and the financial folks that review those plans on our behalf.
My goal with Metro District is that it builds a better development and doesn't just come through with the basics and then the developer reaps the partial rewards. Cause I know they don't get 100% of their money back through a Metro District. Depending on how they structure it, they could get a pretty good chunk of it back. But my opinion is that Metro Districts is just a way of double selling something, in my opinion. Not entirely, but they get
That's what I agree
increase their
with.
profitability and they're marking it up and they're selling that lot twice and getting paid for it a second time through a Metro District refinance or repayment plan.
Trustee Sorsala, did you have something to add?
Are we doing just questions right now or comments as well?
Seems like we were doing both.
Um,
That's fine, I got
Freestyle.
opinions too, I've been giving my opinion, so.
well, a couple of things that stood out to me with this presentation was, first of all, I'm extremely impressed. Like, for our attorney and staff to take the plethora of concerns the board has had and narrow it down to like really safe buffers that are gonna put any metro district, and that's what I think we need to look at is I think in the previous board, there was a desire to really put some stringent regulations in place. But I think the safest thing that we can do as a board is put buffers, that we say we don't want, when Attorney Smith outlined, we wanna reduce any abuses of the system. And that's the best I think we could do as a town is say, we're going to create a buffer zone that's going to reduce any abuses of the system so that those who live in the area, they're not going to experience some of the concerns that we've had. And I just wanna commend staff and the attorney for narrowing out some really I wouldn't say that they're vague, I would say that they're very specific. They're addressing all of the issues we had. I think what I'm hearing from the board is that the issues are with metro districts in general, so we can't solve that issue. However, one thing that stood out to me tonight was a side comment that perhaps we're creating the issue by our stringent extracurricular requirements on developments is requiring them to become a metro district when they otherwise wouldn't have. So we're almost creating a metro district issue by having such stringent extra curricular things that they have to do that they're becoming metro districts. And I just as a light bulb moment, just felt like maybe part of the privilege of not being a metro district is we don't have some of the extracurricular requirements on the development. Like there, like a solar farm or like the bee gardens, maybe those are great things to have, but maybe if we reduce some of those things, we're not adding to this issue, because I don't wanna see our entire community become a metro district.
If we could get a guarantee, I'd agree with you, but I think they're just choosing the easy way out.
My feeling is a metro district is a reward to the developer and not a must-have.
I think, I see your point, I just think we would need an agreement
How
that,
do we reward those who would agree to not be a metro district? That to me would solve more issues.
Developments happen without a metro
Then it
district
would-
than
I
with a
think they
metro
sell
district.
quicker, I don't know, but the people I have talked, not everyone, but the people at Farmstead seem to have deliberately chose out Farmstead for that reason. They did a little more
Many of them do.
search than a regular
I will
person.
say, I think there's a misconception though, that the farmstead still has an HOA and HOA fees they have to pay every month. And they're actually not that different than what you pay in Mill Levy and Heritage Ridge Metro District, that doesn't have an HOA. So your actual costs aren't really that different. They can be dramatically different, right?
That's interesting, okay.
But you know, if you live in a subdivision that doesn't have a metro district, but you have an HOA where you pay a couple $100 a month, that's about what you're probably paying in a metro district.
Yeah, but you can easily dissolve an HOA versus a metro district, which is a more of a legal entity of a government agency.
I don't think it's that easy to dissolve an HOA, but you're right in that like you can't just dissolve a metro district that has to defease its debt, right? I mean, but
I feel like the state's putting more restrictions on HOAs most recently than they have on metro districts. I think they've got catching up to do on both in order to
there's
control
probably
some
some
of
truth
their
to
powers
that.
and their zones, and basically we can't write any code that's more strict than the state, so until the state catches up, you know, with all these loopholes and stuff, it's gonna take time, you know, government doesn't move fast, it's kinda slow.
For my part, I feel like these policies, I feel way more comfortable approving a metro district if we're seeing the service plan ahead of time, it's clearly identified. We're making sure that that there's education out there for homeowners at time of buying as well as on our website. I feel like those policies make me feel better as a town, that we're actually looking out for the citizens that are buying these homes. So I feel great about this policy. I think when we wanna talk about metro districts in general, I don't like metro districts. I'd hate for our entire community to be under a metro district at some point right in the far future, but that's a more global issue that we could talk about. What are ways we can look at, you know, what we're doing as a town that might be making this more of a pronounced thing, that I feel like we can address separately. But the policy, I feel like helps us move forward with existing applications for development. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I see your point. I have a different outlook on the incentives for developers. I think ideally, I would agree with you. I just think they're looking for I think they're gonna do it no matter what, cause it sounds easier. I just wanna make sure if they do it, that they're hitting the points. So,
I do think, with respect to the concerns that you outlined, Mayor Karshbeck, my assumption is that if, specifically in relation to the public benefits, right, like environmental sustainability, as it's defined in the policy, they have to explain to the board how they're gonna develop public improvements that deliver or facilitate specific measurable environmental outcomes, including but not limited to, so we're trying to give them some like, here's some of the things you could do, including but not limited to reduction of greenhouse gases, conservation of water or energy, encourage multimodal transportation, enhance community resiliency against future environmental events like flooding or drought, increase renewable energy capacity. I can come up with a lot of very specific things a developer could do that would be far above and beyond what would be required.
yeah, and that's,
If they came in and said, the way we're meeting the environmental sustainability requirement of your service plan policy is that we're gonna use the town's adopted codes for landscape,
Right.
water efficient landscaping, I would expect the town board to go,
that's not
that's
environmental.
not what we're doing.
You have to give water back to the river to be
And to be
environmental.
honest, I wouldn't bring that to you and say that I think that meets the extraordinary public benefit test of our service plan policy. So I think,
Okay.
I don't think that either we as staff would recommend or that you as the board would accept them coming in and saying, we're meeting the terms of your service plan policy by just doing the bare
Yeah.
minimum required by your.
And when you explained that earlier, it makes a lot of sense, and it was also in the packet, so I apologize, but that
No,
makes total sense.
it's a great question, and I think it's important that we kind of understand what that really
Mine's a little tacked here, but I have a feeling, and you've stated this before, but Tyrion's gonna do a metro no matter what, sounds like, to get this big thing done.
They already have a metro
Yeah,
district.
sorry, yeah, they're gonna come back for an update, higher mill levy.
Yeah.
We really need a fire department out there. And I've talked to chief, and it seems like they're not willing to raise their impact fees. So they wanna come back to us existing residents for a bond to help out new residents.
So
So
here,
it's-
when we talk about critical public infrastructure
Mhm.
being a required extraordinary public benefit of a service plan, that might be one of the ones that
And that's
you-
one of the two that are required?
That is one of the, no, that's one of the,
Choices.
that's one of the electives that you could choose. But it sure would go a long way in selling their need to fund a metro district to be able to say, in addition to all this great environmental sustainability and smart growth management we're gonna incorporate into our development, we're also gonna build some public infrastructure like a fire district building with the metro district.
In there, cause yeah, my thought process, no matter what, they're gonna come back. So how do we get the most out of this for that? Cause they're essentially building a town and we shouldn't go back to us for money for that.
I don't disagree with you at all.
Okay.
I do think it's fair that a development of a certain scale should have to contribute to public safety costs.
We agree wholeheartedly. And for what it's worth, they already know that and expect that.
The entire
It's encouraging.
point of metro districts, they were created for this very purpose of taxing us here to build something we're never gonna get to use directly. That's why metro districts were invented in the first place.
I think you'd be not taxing us here, but yes.
Yes, but that's why.
Yeah,
They couldn't raise taxes for us to do it there,
it's
so
for
that's what
development
they
to
are.
pay for the infrastructure that it needs.
That's
Right.
why it was made in the
Just
first
to the
place.
city, they're
That's the perfect concept.
way up there.
And we've been
That would be great.
trying to put bumpers around the damn thing, trying to get the genie back in the bottle ever since it got abused,
It's cat back
and
in the
it
van.
can't get done.
Well, that's why I appreciate this presentation because it really streamlined a very complex list of concerns and put legalities around it that I feel like are really fair. So I think we're getting closer, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary benefit wise, I mean, formulaic wise, I think it's the right approach, cause we'll look at this and we could ask them, hey, isn't this already in our code? Well, yeah, well, that doesn't really count as extraordinary benefit now, does it? So essentially, it's a chance for them to kind of walk out what they plan on offering as opposed to street lamps and sidewalks, which is what we wanted, so.
Well, you said this is not required, so we have to be careful to ensure that this is somehow required.
Which part's not
The
required?
critical public infrastructure.
Yeah, so, and
And they gotta talk to the fire
you can
chief,
make
'cause I don't
that
think he
one
knows
of the
this.
required, I mean. So this is one of those conversations where a development of that magnitude is gonna have some really specific demands that don't exist in like a Heritage Ridge subdivision, right? And so part of their process in saying what are the things that we're gonna have to pay for to be able to develop out here is things like, you know, are we gonna have to build a sheriff's substation? Are we gonna have to build a fire district building? Are we gonna have to expand the wastewater treatment plant, which we already know they're gonna have to do? Are we gonna have to build a water treatment plant to treat South Platte River water, which the answer is yes, they're gonna have to do that. And we don't want the current tax and ratepayers to pay for that, so the Metro District's gonna fund it. And those will be critical public infrastructure items that are necessary to serve their development. But do those qualify, like water and wastewater, does that qualify under the way that we've written it here? That address significant infrastructure challenges previously identified by the town, either within or proximate to the district, whether such improvements address a locally significant challenge or townwide challenge. That is where you get to decide, I think, under the context of this policy, do those things they're gonna have to build rise to the level of critical public infrastructure being met and paid for as part of this service plan? And so they'll have to explain to you what those things are,
Yeah, I think it's schools.
and you'll get the chance to say, we agree with you or we don't.
So with this plan that we've got written here, I think one of the things, the objectives was that it would possibly eliminate smaller developments like a Rose Farm or Heritage Ridge that has just one metro district, but would allow larger developments like Tyrion or the golf course that
This-
has 18 districts to build these big, huge.
This policy would not do that,
That would not eliminate a small,
not at all.
because they still
You
have-
might review that policy a little differently, when we talk about you know, environmental sustainability, you might expect less from a development of 300 lots than a development of 4,000 lots. But I don't think there's any, personally, I don't believe there's anything in this policy that a development like Rose Farm couldn't have addressed. And frankly, probably addressed some of in the context of their development.
And then is there a reason why we didn't address the size of the metro districts? Like, they have to have a certain number of homes within the district?
Yeah, and
It seems like
I talked to Charles Norton about that, and he felt like that without going into a million specifics, there are good reason in some cases for very small districts to exist. That there is not a need or a practical reason to limit based on the number of lots or the number of houses. And rather, can they defease the debt that they're proposing with the proposed assessed value, and are they providing all the benefits that are required under the policy? And if that's 50 houses or 5,000 houses, practically speaking, doesn't make a big difference in the terms of policy.
because it just seems odd that, I mean, I understand because they build in phases. It just seems almost intentional sometimes where they have just, each of their metro districts is only 500 homes, which then you gotta fill a board of 5 people, so that's a 1 in 100 people to run for office.
For what it's worth, we had the same exact argument when we were required by law to redistrict in California.
Yeah.
Cause some of those districts had like, 5,000, well, no, like 2,000 people in them, and it was like, it's easy to find 5 people to run for a city council in a town of 12,000 people. It's a lot harder to get people to run for the city council in an area of 2,000 people.
That's tough.
So, yes, I mean, I understand your point, but
And then metro districts can't combine, so if they have 18 metro districts, 5, 6, and 8, can't merge it together and make a new larger metro district.
They could districts could ultimately consolidate, but they'd have to come back to the board, cause it would be a change to their service.
they couldn't do that on their own.
Yeah,
So when is Attorney Norton, this is gonna come back?
It can, yeah, I mean, well, it will, because it won't get approved if it
I was gonna
doesn't.
say, I think we got some questions still,
Yeah,
and we need to mull on this a bit.
That's fine, and if I may suggest, if you have questions that come up as you think about this and mull on it, our goal would be to bring it back to you in November or December, depending on when we can get it scheduled, and I'll coordinate with the mayor and mayor pro tem on that. But go ahead and submit those questions, we'll gather them all up, we'll make them part of the packet so everybody knows what questions were asked. We can provide those responses ahead of time, or we can just wait and do it during the next meeting too, either way is fine. But if you have questions we didn't talk about tonight, or if you come up with a question, cause we all think about this stuff in the shower, right? So it's like,
Staring at the
tomorrow
ceiling,
morning
yeah.
at 6 o'clock, you'll go, wait a minute, I should have asked. Just send those to us, we'll gather them up, we'll have answers prepared to the extent that we can. Or we'll tell you we can't come up with an answer for that if we can't, but we'll do that in the next meeting.
I'll probably research this, but I'll throw the question out there. Is there any evidence that shows that having a metro district or a community that allows or not allows metro districts, how that affects the rate of growth in their communities?
Not that I know of,
Does it slow it down? Does it speed it up?
I honestly don't know. I don't know if a
Like,
study has been done.
Longmont doesn't have them.
It would be probably some kind of university study, I don't know.
Yeah. Be interesting. Okay, cool. Is there anything else pressing by the trustees on this? Otherwise, you can always email Attorney or Administrator Kirk.
I was
This will
just
come
gonna
back.
mention that it was one of our high level objectives to get the Metro District policy in place, correct?
By February of
So
next year.
it'd be great to see a policy get implemented since the board's fresh on it and we're fresh on it, so to be diligent about getting questions in, because
Good point.
it would feel great to have this buttoned up so that when we have things come before us, we at least have something, a framework that we feel good about,
It's only been 4 years in the making, I mean, what's the rush?
right?
Cool.
But let's not keep talking about it.
I love the idea of having it adopted and done for what it's worth, so let's.
Just in case any of the folks in the audience were here for this, if would you guys wish to speak on a metro district? Guess not. Okay, cool.
Join the dog pile?
Mayor
Alright.
Parsbeck, if I may, I know we have reports still, if I may suggest, Mr. McCarty is here tonight, I think he did wanna speak to you before you go into executive session. if it's up to you, but maybe I'll suggest that you allow him to do that before we do any reports, and then that way if he's done, he can leave.
Yeah, makes sense. That's a great
Since
idea.
we've made him wait this long,
Yeah, well,
so.
I'd say you know more about water now, but you already know everything, so.
Yeah, I was thinking, when I'm working on an appraisal with metro districts and complex water, I'm done by about 4 o'clock, so I'm impressed that everybody's made it till 10 tonight. So we wanted to talk to you, you're passing those out. This is my wife Dinah McCarty, and I'm Kevin McCarty, for those of you who might not know me already. So we own 61 acres on the west side of Road 7, half mile south of 56, both sides of the Little Thompson River. And we're trying to, one of our goals, we've owned this property since 1995, and one of our goals is to see the river corridor preserved, and I think we're in a position to where maybe we can be a catalyst for Berthoud in trying to finally start towards preservation of the river corridor. And I know the town's always wanted a trail system. I think it's more than just about a trail for the Little Thompson River, though. I think it's a tremendous wildlife corridor and an important view shed. I think our property, especially along the river there, looking west from Road 7, is an important view shed for the community. And so we want to start discussing with the town about a possible acquisition of at least the river corridor. We want to still live there and take care of it, so we'd like to see a long-term transaction, either buying it over time or a purchase and a lease back. And we'd certainly want to participate with the town in trying to seek out some funding for that. I think GOCO in particular has a river initiative that I think would be a possibility to find some funding there. Unfortunately, we're in Weld County, so Larimer County funds aren't available to us, but we would certainly want to work with the town if there's some interest in purchasing the river corridor from us. What we would want to do would be in conjunction with a conservation district, an annexation under a conservation district zone. We like the idea of being able to put a conservation easement on the property and leaving some development. Just doing a conservation easement on everything, I just don't think there's the before and after margin where we'd be compensated by doing an easement without having a development. I think once we had vested rights in the from the conservation development, then it would open the door for us to do a conservation easement on everything. Not that we're promising that, but I think our main focus initially would be to hopefully work out a deal to where the town could own this piece of the river corridor and maybe be a catalyst for other properties along the river corridor. Because my personal opinion is I think the town needs to think more about what these other communities have done. When you look at Longmont and Loveland and Fort Collins and Greeley, they certainly have moved towards trails along the river, but they've done it by acquiring the river corridor. And I think if Berthoud at some point were to have ownership all along the river corridor between I-25 and the existing town, I think it would open the door to exactly how you might design a trail system that took into account the wildlife habitat and natural areas and everything too. So I think this is an opportunity to start that process with the town.
Great, thank you very much.
You bet. And I've kind of included a little history on our place and some pictures and stuff, and you're certainly welcome to come out and take a look at it. And it's easy to drive by and see, obviously from Road 7. So.
I don't think it's, if trustees have questions, I don't, but I don't think it's inappropriate to ask them while you're here.
Sure.
We don't really know much because we haven't gone into executive session, but I guess otherwise, yeah, we can go out to County Road 7 and look in the road, I guess. Okay,
Right, cool.
thank you very much.
Thanks, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's go on to reports here. We'll start off with trustee Hardy.
Two things. November 26th is Small Business Saturday. It's a nationally recognized event. Gonna try and coordinate a lot of the events that are going on downtown that day. Moving the lighted Christmas parade to that night at 6 o'clock. So we'll bring Santa in, put him on a fire truck, get him off at Fickle Park to do the tree lighting. Get the holiday season off downtown and hopefully encourage a lot of people to come downtown and spend some money, and we'll be doing some gift baskets hopefully for what we've done before.
November 26th.
November 26th, day after Black Friday.
Might be in the hospital, but okay.
Oh, well, hopefully I won't be either.
Oh, bum rushes at Walmart and stuff.
So that's the next event that I've got on my calendar that I'm working on with Birth of Main Street.
Cool.
Then another thing I keep seeing pop up on Facebook is the concern over school bus crossings from Turner onto Mountain Avenue at 9th Street. It seems like they kind of, when one goes, they all go, and I guess people say that it seems kind of dangerous because there's no light there. I was wondering if maybe we could get a sheriff's deputy to kind of help out during school hours to get those buses out of there in a safer manner.
From Turner onto 9th Street?
No, from 9th Street onto Mountain Avenue, as they come out of Turner Junior High.
So they're crossing in between
They all drive
Larry's
south
Main
onto,
Street.
they'll drive south on 9th to Mountain Avenue, and then they try and cross to go over to the high school. And so there's no light there.
I think you're saying a little west of the current pedestrian
You talking
lane
about
crossing.
8th or 9th?
9th.
Cause if they don't
think I've
turn
ever seen a
left
bus
on
go through
Massachusetts and then go south on 8th to use the light.
But you're not talking about buses, you're talking about kids crossing, right?
No, I'm talking about the buses crossing the highway, and when one bus goes, the other bus goes in behind them, and then
Right.
people are like, I've just been seeing the complaint multiple times on Facebook, so I was just wondering if we could maybe check that out with
I'll
our.
have to look into it, I'm not sure I know,
So there's
I'm not sure I know what you're
There's a
describing.
stop sign there, but the buses are not observing that. They've got a buddy deal that they just all start going.
Yeah.
And it is confusing for pedestrian traffic and driving traffic on 56.
Maybe we just need to start issuing tickets to the bus drivers for breaking the law.
I mean,
I can see why they're doing it though.
I do too, I
They're all-
empathize with them, they would sit there forever.
We'll make a note, yeah.
But that's not 9th though, that's you're talking about the blinky light then?
Basically, if you drove straight across Mountain Avenue, you'd go into Pizza Hut.
Yeah, so that's like 8.5, I don't know what
That's
street that
9th
is.
Street.
I think it is.
Oh, it is 9th,
I
you're
think
right,
it's
10th is the one
yeah.
after that, okay.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you're saying they're turning out onto Mountain Avenue and they're not observing the stop sign, they're just all going in a line?
Yeah, when one goes, they all kind of chase after each other and go out, and people driving on Mountain Avenue are saying, hey, why didn't that bus stop?
That's a good question.
It causes a little chaos with the kids crossing, because it's after school. The buses all line up
I
and
don't,
leave.
I don't know
It
why the
gets-
buses aren't following the law.
It
Because
gets
it's taking
really-
forever,
It's
I
an
think,
opportunity for them to go.
Of
whereas
course.
otherwise traffic is not allowing them to get out on the road.
yeah, probably actually safer in my, I don't know, I'm just thinking about it now.
Yeah, I mean, the
That's why
only,
we're doing it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
yeah, I mean, the only alternative is to post an officer out there to
But just wondering if we could.
stop traffic and allow them to do that, or to tell them you
Yeah,
just have to
that's the way to
stop
do
at
it,
the
stop
stop sign and
traffic.
wait, I mean, I don't know.
Get maybe a little traffic assistance there for that, 20 minutes of the buses trying to
I'll
escape.
talk to Sergeant Anderson, see what his suggestions are.
They can just get the buses, okay, Sergeant Anderson's gonna stop the highway for 5 minutes, go, go, go. So, but that's the only thing else I got on my
Alright, thanks, trustee Ayers?
Yeah, so the port committee met last Wednesday. The bathroom at Fickle is going up soon, was the time frame on that. There's some cones out there now, so I think they're
Oh, that's
they
what's
are
going on
actually,
over there.
yeah, they're actually in the process of getting everything set up.
Installing
I wondering
utilities
what they
right
were
now.
digging up over
That's
there.
right.
The Vine Park obstacle course is basically up, and apparently the kids are loving it, and it's just it turned into less of a course than just kind of a field where everyone just goes and gets on the different obstacles.
We'll be doing some posts and press stuff about that this week.
My kids told me there's a new ninja course in town. I'm like, what?
It's actually what it is.
I didn't
Yeah.
know. So cool.
Gotcha, check it out.
The major point from the last meeting was there was a tour of the Jaskowski property. And it was brought before the committee to kind of get discussion for what to do with that property. And there was a lot of confusion about what it was possible to do with that property because it's incredibly limited because of the deed restrictions. It seems like it's moving towards staying something dog oriented, but there was also a conversation about whether or not to sell it off or to keep it since it is town-owned property. But that's gonna come up on the agenda for the November meeting and for kind of final direction to staff to kind of, I don't know how many times I've said kind of today, I'm not hungry, but to move forward with that and get it set at least in a general direction of where it should go.
You're talking about a committee making property acquisition and selling conversations?
No, they would make a recommendation to the town
Right.
board.
Right.
The town board would make that decision, but the committee is looking at what are the options available for use of the property and make a recommendation to the board about what we should do with it.
Cool.
And that's all I have.
Awesome. I got a question for you with Port. Is there any discussion on the trail standards for the width and what we ran into with Vantage?
No, would you like me to bring that up?
I think it would be great, so we don't have to run in that again, but I was gonna ask Chris, but since you're on the committee, great, thanks. Trustee Sorsali.
The only thing I have was just a recommendation, since we have a communications person, and I know we talked about one of our high level goals being a communications plan. One of the things I think that I'm sure would be helpful for all of us is if there was some way to mitigate online conversations, like when I did information stuff for the fire department, if you ever saw something on the community page that was maybe misguided information, there was somebody, myself, who would get on there and help point them to the right information. And I think that would be helpful, because I know there's been a lot of misinformation about how a new school would be funded in Berthoud recently. And everyone did a great job, I think, trying to point people in the right direction, but it'd be awesome to have that be part of our communications plan, that someone from staff is watching those comments and can even maybe just post a link to the information or find a really great way to just kind of head off those crazy conversations, because they go about 5,000 ways and then the whole town is confused about where the new school's coming from. And so it'd be great to just have someone who's monitoring it and just kind of daily pointing people to accurate information. And even if that's, hey, if you have additional ideas or concerns, please email your town board or email the town staff for accurate information. And maybe even eventually having like a phone line where people could call in with a question, like a bank almost, where they could leave a voicemail and say, hey, can I get an answer on this? And someone could return those phone calls and
The good news is, anybody that calls town hall gets directed to somebody to answer their question already, so I don't
That's
know that
good
we
too.
need another phone line, but I think
No,
that your point is a good one.
however we can direct them to accurate information that's like speedily available before that rabbit trail gets any crazier.
It would be nice if people would just call before they started announcing to the world their expertise, but that's okay.
Next door is a source of facts.
I do, but we understand I certainly understand your point. It's something we've talked about. How do we deal with comments and which pages do we need to monitor and, you know.
Yeah, thank you, that's it.
Cool. Trustee Butler. Alright.
Nothing.
Trustee Murphy?
Yeah, some brief stuff, just kind of looking through the budget stuff, and expenditures. I was just wondering, do we have an update on where we're at with the Spartan stuff? The crossing down there?
The plans are about 95% done, and that will trigger the formal submittals to the PUC and the railroad.
Mhm.
The railroad's been asking us, which actually I think is a good sign, like,
What?
when are we getting your plans? So that's good. We've developed a relationship with them over there. So we're expecting to submit plans to the railroad for initial review before the end of the year. That could be a 5-year-long process, so I don't want you to feel like that
Sure,
means.
sure.
Just
been a while
realistically, there's no timeline, the railroad doesn't. But our plans for that crossing are sufficiently done for submittal hopefully before the end of the year.
Okay. And then you got tree committee coming up next Monday. Sent you an email on some of the detailed stuff that we've kind of been discussing in the committee. Are you working on that or
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we were already working on that before we got your email, but
That's all I've got.
Alright, Mayor Pro Tem?
See, youth advisory, I guess I'll start out with a question actually over to Clerk Samora. Has Grazi been in touch with you with a couple of dozen questions about the entire process of being a committee?
Yes,
Okay.
she did reach out, I believe it was someone with a number of questions. We'll be working to meet up either later this week or beginning of next week
Okay.
to address those questions.
Okay, yeah, last meeting, there's a lot of like, wait, what's our budget? Wait, we haven't done, wait, what? And a lot of this catch up from Scorch Fest, so met with them, they're in the midst of doing that, reaching out with you and working out some of that information, including the Yanitz Fund, as to possibly refilming it. Apparently it's a little old, they wanna redo it. But yeah, other than meeting with you, that was the biggest high notes for youth advisory. And think that's it for me.
Awesome. I have really no report. I actually spent some time at Oktoberfest with Paul and fantastic, so answering all these kind of complex questions for people on trees, so. But other than that, no, I have no report. Great, Steph?
just I thought I'd mention because I think it's kind of cool, but we our business development manager Walt, we purchased a software called Placer AI, I think is how you say it. But it allows us to gather up all kinds of demographic data and consumer spending habits that we can use for business traction, we can use for business support for businesses that want access to that information, and also to see like how many people went to the Oktoberfest based on like cell phone data. So there was almost 3,000 people at the Oktoberfest, at least according to that service. It doesn't mean that's 100% of the people there, because some people may not have had a cell phone with them or may have their location services turned off, but it's a pretty good rough estimate about the number of people there.
Technology.
It's pretty neat.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just learned about this
And it
last
can
week.
tell you, and it can tell you where they're coming from and all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff.
The NPO just did a study, a transit study, and it was really accurate, like how they do it. And like, oh, we just bought this a big chunk of information on where people go for the last year or something. It's like, holy cow, yeah.
Hold on.
It's pretty amazing, it's a pretty amazing technology, and we can provide some of that information to local businesses, they can target market where their customers are coming from, and things, all kinds of stuff, so kinda cool, since you mentioned Oktoberfest. Walt and I were discussing that this morning. The only other thing for me is just a reminder that next week is our joint meeting with the school district board from 5 to 7. There's no agenda, it's just they provide food, and it's just an opportunity to kind of talk and chat about what's going on in our respective agencies and get to know each other, and we've been doing that now for quite a while. It's always a good deal. So, it's a noticed public meeting, nobody ever shows up but us, of course, but that'll be at the high school, and so for all of you that have already RSVP'd, thank you for responding.
See you next
Good
Wednesday.
turnout, so we'll see you next Wednesday there.
Okay, cool.
That reminds me of something I wanted to bring up, and I don't know how else to do it other than in a public meeting, but one of the comments on some of these conversations about a new school for Berthoud, somebody mentioned, could Berthoud have its own school district? And I don't know the complexities of that, but it did make me wonder why no one's ever, I've never heard anyone ask that question, and I would like to know what the possibilities are for that now that we are a big enough community and we have a lot of tax dollars, that we would have more governance over how we use that if it was localized. So I'm just curious if anyone else would like to hear conversation on that to see.
It's been talked about before. I know Mr. Boyd's brought it up before at times, just in casual conversation before he was on the board about talks about that, because people in Berthoud have always felt like the redheaded stepchild to Thompson School District. But if you talk to any of the board members in the past on Thompson School District, it was, oh no, Berthoud's always gotten their fair share, their equal cut.
I'd love to talk to, I don't think we could do Turion without eventually being our own school district.
I'd like to know, yeah, cause we've doubled in size since
That'd
I've
be good
moved
to bring
here,
up next
so I
Wednesday.
think we're at the point where that conversation at least we need to know what our
I can tell you that
options are.
Weld RE5J might not agree with you.
I know, that's what
They're-
Nate's
they're
point, I
counting
think
on
you have
that.
to vote yourself out and
Yeah,
they-
we couldn't ask Thompson District, right? They're not gonna say if
Thompson
they
might be
want
fine
that.
voting us out, but they'll get a head count, so
We feel
we
about
actually,
it.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, we'd have to look into it, I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, and you'd be responsible for any debt that's been issued.
When we were talking about fire department, I'd love to do a school if in Metro, just for this reason that we have that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of, yeah, we need to think about a school
Agenda
district.
item
I'd be
meeting.
interested to see how it's done.
Get some more conversation on that would be great.
By the school, and any other debt that the school district.
If I may, that's a major undertaking, and I don't know that that's a town issue per se.
It's a community
It'd
issue.
be like a
It is a
citizen
community issue,
initiative.
and certainly we would wanna be a part of that conversation, we'd have to talk about
You'd need to.
how much time and energy you want town staff to spend trying to figure out how to start a school district.
I see.
Well, one of the
If
reasons
you want-
why I see it being pressing
You could
is-
ask next Wednesday, cause I've talked about this for a couple of years with the superintendent, and he actually looked it up, but you have to have 2 elections, Weld, in, like Attorney Smith said, you gotta pay off whatever's left. They actually said, I'll help you whenever way you want, so I think he's neutral on the issue, but I think, Chris, you're right, it's Weld too, that's a lot of money for them, so.
Yeah,
Yes,
you'd have to
Turion especially.
you'd have to exclude from the school district and then
Well,
create a
I
district.
think that's like a separate, like a side issue to just us
Yeah.
managing our own school district, but I think even when I look at the dynamics of Loveland versus Berthoud, there are different demographics and different concerns, different desires from those communities. And it'd be really nice for Berthoud people to have a say in Berthoud schools more directly, instead of being one voice on a board.
Yeah.
So that, I just keyed off something that I had never thought of, and I will let the rest of the board decide if we wanna spend resources
It's
researching
been a
that.
hot topic for a long time.
We could talk about it next Wednesday with the school district.
I think that's a good
That's a good start.
time to ask the
I'm
question.
imagining they're gonna say, please don't do that, right? So I
They
can
could be
imagine
fed
that's
up
not
with it, we
going
never
to
know,
be their
you know?
desire,
They might be
but-
like, great, you can have that, who knows, yeah.
I don't know.
That's a good start.
It's just
The superintendent's really open to at least looking into it.
Here's the keys.
Cool, alright, would anyone like to move us into executive session?
Ours, you actually forgot attorney's fees.
I have nothing to give,
Oh,
especially
thank you.
given the lateness of the hour.
Thank you very much, man, I'm forgetting to do that.
I move to enter into executive session pursuant to Colorado Revised Statute 246402 4EI to determine positions relative to matters that may be subject to negotiations, developing a strategy for negotiations and instructing negotiators, following details are provided, potential property purchase.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, trustee Harrison, second, quickly roll call vote please.
Trustee Martin.
Yes.
Trustee Huckrow.
Yes.
Trustee Swett.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Gray.
Yes.
Trustee Harris. Yes. Trustee Harvey.
Yes.
Mayor Carter.
Yes. Alright, thank you very much.